The morning air in Montana's Flathead Valley carried the crisp scent of pine and the promise of summer's arrival. Lila Kim adjusted her easel on the uneven ground, the legs sinking slightly into the soft earth as she positioned it to capture the sweeping vista before her. At 29, she'd spent the last 7 years building a modest reputation as a landscape artist, with a particular talent for capturing the raw, untamed beauty of the American West. Her small apartment in Kalispell featured a wall covered with sketches and studies, preliminary work for the oil paintings that provided her livelihood. Lila had moved to Montana 3 years ago from Seattle, drawn by the rugged landscapes and the lower cost of living. Her parents, first-generation Korean immigrants who had settled in Washington state, where the grasslands met the rising foothills of the Swan Range. It was a location she'd scouted the previous weekend, attracted by the interplay of light and shadow as the morning sun crested the mountains. The meadow was dotted with wildflowers, early bloomers pushing through after the winter snow had receded, and the distant trees created a perfect frame for the mountains beyond. Lila had parked her car at a small turnout off the Forest Service road, careful to leave enough space for other vehicles to pass. She'd checked in at the ranger station the day before, as she always did when planning to work in more remote areas. The ranger on duty, a weathered man named Mike Ellison who looked to be in his 50s, had warned her to be cautious. "We've had increased bear activity this spring," he'd told her, tapping a map spread out on the counter between them. "Particularly in this eastern section. Grizzly sow with cubs was spotted near Elk Creek last week." "I'll be careful," Lila had assured him, patting the bear spray canister attached to her belt. "I've done the bear safety course, and I never go anywhere without this." Mike had nodded approvingly but added, "Just remember, Ms. Kim, no painting is worth your life. Bears are waking up hungry after winter, and they can be especially aggressive when protecting cubs." Now, as she set up her easel and arranged her materials, Lila recalled his warning. She'd chosen this spot partly because of its relatively open sightlines. The park guidelines recommended being able to see at least 100 yards in all directions in bear country, and while the meadow didn't quite offer that, it provided decent visibility. The dense forest began about 75 yards behind her, but in front was open meadow, leading to scattered pine stands and then the mountains. Lila worked methodically, setting out her supplies with practiced efficiency. A wooden case contained her assortment of pencils, charcoals, and pastels. A smaller leather pouch held her blending stumps, erasers, and sharpening tools. Her sketchbook, a high-quality hardbound volume with thick, acid-free paper, was positioned on the easel, open to a fresh page. She'd start with preliminary sketches, capturing the basic composition and light before deciding which medium would best serve the final piece. As she worked, Lila maintained awareness of her surroundings, occasionally scanning the tree line and making more noise than necessary as she moved about. She hummed softly to herself, occasionally breaking into the chorus of whatever song was stuck in her head that morning. Today it was an old Fleetwood Mac tune her father used to play when she was a child. Making noise was another recommended precaution in bear country. You never wanted to surprise a bear. The first hour passed quickly as Lila blocked in the basic shapes of the landscape. The morning light changed rapidly, and she worked to capture the essence of the scene rather than its momentary specifics. Her hand moved confidently across the paper, the soft scratch of charcoal a counterpoint to the chirping of birds and the gentle rustle of wind through grass. It was during a pause, as she stepped back to assess her work, that she noticed movement at the edge of the forest. Instinctively, she froze, her eyes straining to identify the source. For a moment, she thought it might be a deer or elk, common enough sights in the valley, but as the shape emerged from the shadows of the trees, her breath caught in her throat. A grizzly bear ambled into the clearing, its massive form unmistakable even at a distance. The morning sunlight caught its fur, highlighting the silver-tipped hairs that gave the grizzly its name. Lila's first impulse was to grab her gear and run for the car, but years of outdoor education kicked in, overriding her panic. Running could trigger the bear's predatory instincts. Besides, her vehicle was over 100 yards away, too far to reach before a charging bear would overtake her. Instead, she remained still, her heart hammering against her ribs as she assessed the situation. The bear didn't appear to have noticed her yet. It moved with the unhurried gait of an animal secure in its dominance of the landscape, occasionally pausing to investigate something in the grass or sniff the air. Lila estimated the distance between them at about 50 yards. closer than she'd ever been to a wild grizzly, but still far enough that she might not register as a threat if she remained calm and quiet. Her mind raced through the bear safety protocols she'd learned. Make yourself known gradually to avoid startling it. Speak in a calm, firm voice. Back away slowly if possible. Use bear spray only as a last resort if charged. "Hey, bear," she called out, her voice surprisingly steady despite her fear. "Just letting you know I'm here." The grizzly's head swung in her direction, ears perked and nostrils flaring as it caught her scent. Lila felt a chill run down her spine as the bear's small, dark eyes fixed on her. For a long moment, they regarded each other across the meadow, artist and subject in an unexpected encounter. The bear dropped back to all fours, seeming more curious than aggressive. It tilted its head slightly, as if trying to determine what manner of creature had interrupted its morning routine. Lila's training told her to back away, to create distance between herself and the animal, but another impulse, the artist's instinct to capture the extraordinary, made her hesitate. The bear wasn't charging, it wasn't showing signs of aggression, and it was magnificent, a perfect specimen of wilderness incarnate, with muscles rippling beneath its thick fur and sunlight glinting off its curved claws as it pawed absently at the ground. With trembling fingers, Lila reached for her sketchbook, never taking her eyes off the grizzly. If the bear approached, she'd abandon her gear and retreat to the car. But if it kept its distance, this could be the opportunity of a lifetime, a chance to sketch one of nature's most formidable predators from direct observation. "Easy there, big guy," she murmured, the familiar action of pencil against paper helping to calm her nerves. "You do your thing and I'll do mine." The bear settled onto its haunches about 50 yards away, apparently content to rest in the morning sun. Lila's initial sketches were quick and rough, her strokes capturing the bear's massive silhouette and distinctive shoulder hump. As her confidence grew, her lines became more precise, detailing the grizzly's facial features, the texture of its fur, the powerful curve of its jaw. Time seemed suspended as Lila worked, the world narrowing to the dance between observation and creation. She'd filled 3 pages with studies of the bear from different angles as it shifted position, occasionally standing on its hind legs to survey the meadow before settling back down. For nearly 20 minutes, artist and subject coexisted in an uneasy truce, separated by 50 yards of wildflowers and mutual wariness. The idyll was shattered when a gust of wind swept across the meadow, carrying Lila's scent more directly toward the grizzly. The bear's demeanor changed instantly. It rose to its full height, towering over the surrounding vegetation, and released a deep, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the earth beneath Lila's feet. Lila felt her body go cold with primal fear. This was no longer the calm, distant subject of her sketches. This was an apex predator, suddenly aware and alert to a potential threat or prey. The grizzly dropped to all fours, its head low and swinging from side to side, a posture she recognized from wildlife documentaries as a precursor to charging. "Hey, bear, I'm just leaving," Lila called out, her voice higher and less controlled than before. She began backing toward her car, abandoning her easel and supplies. The bear spray was in her right hand now, safety cap off and ready to deploy. The grizzly took a few lumbering steps forward, then stopped, seeming to reassess. Lila continued her slow retreat, maintaining eye contact without staring directly at the bear, a fine line between awareness and challenge. Each backward step took her closer to safety, but the distance felt impossibly vast. Then something changed. Perhaps it was a shift in the wind, carrying a new scent, or maybe some subtle movement on Lila's part triggered the bear's predatory instinct. Whatever the cause, the grizzly's hesitation vanished in an instant. It charged. The speed of a charging grizzly is something most people never witness firsthand. Despite weighing hundreds of pounds, a bear can reach 30 miles per hour in seconds. Lila had read this fact in ranger pamphlets and wildlife guides, but academic knowledge paled against the terrifying reality of 300 pounds of muscle and fury barreling toward her across the meadow. Instinct overrode training. Lila turned and ran. Her boots pounded against the uneven ground as she sprinted toward her car, the sound of her own desperate breathing nearly drowning out the bear's heavy footfalls behind her. She risked a glance over her shoulder and saw the grizzly closing the distance with horrifying speed, its open mouth revealing yellowed teeth designed for tearing flesh. The bear spray was still clutched in her hand, useless now that she'd committed to flight. Her easel stood between them, a flimsy barrier that might buy her precious seconds. She heard the crash as the bear collided with it, followed by the ripping of canvas and the crack of splintering wood. Lila's sketchbook went flying from her hand as she pushed herself harder, legs burning and lungs screaming for oxygen. The Subaru was 30 yards away now, keys in her pocket. Would she have time to retrieve them? To open the door? The bear was closing fast, its hot breath almost palpable on the back of her neck. 20 yards. The sound of destruction behind her had momentarily ceased, and Lila dared to hope that perhaps the bear had lost interest in the chase. But a thunderous roar shattered that illusion, spurring her to an even more desperate pace. 10 yards. Her fingers closed around the keys in her pocket, pulling them out with such force that she nearly dropped them. The electronic key fob had a panic button. She pressed it repeatedly as she ran, and the Subaru's lights flashed as the horn began to blare. The sudden noise confused the bear, causing it to hesitate momentarily in its pursuit. That hesitation was enough. Lila reached the driver's door, yanked it open and threw herself inside, pulling the door closed behind her just as the grizzly recovered and lunged forward. The impact of the bear against the side of the vehicle rocked it on its suspension. Lila fumbled with the keys, trying to get them into the ignition with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Outside, the grizzly circled the car, occasionally rising on its hind legs to peer through the windows or swiping powerful claws against the metal, with sounds that made Lila wince. Finally, the key slid home. Lila started the engine and shifted into drive, pressing the accelerator perhaps harder than necessary in her haste to put distance between herself and the enraged bear. The Subaru's tires spun briefly on the loose surface of the turnout before finding purchase, and the vehicle lurched forward onto the Forest Service road. In the rearview mirror, Lila could see the grizzly standing in the middle of the turnout, watching as she drove away. Even in her state of shock and terror, some part of her brain registered the powerful image, the massive bear framed by mountains and sky, a force of nature that had nearly claimed her life. The drive back to the ranger station passed in a blur. Lila's mind kept replaying the encounter in vivid detail, the initial wonder of seeing the bear, the false sense of security as she sketched, the heart-stopping moment when it charged, the desperate sprint for survival. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel, and she realized she was gulping air in short, shallow breaths that weren't doing much to alleviate the light-headedness she felt. "Pull it together," she muttered to herself, consciously slowing her breathing. "You're okay, you made it." But she knew how close it had been. Seconds later, or if the car horn hadn't startled the bear, or if she'd dropped her keys, any slight variation in circumstances, and the outcome would have been drastically different. Bear attacks were rare, but when they occurred, they were often fatal. The ranger station came into view, a log and stone building set back from the main road with the Forest Service shield prominently displayed. Lila pulled into the parking lot and shut off the engine, sitting motionless for a moment, as the adrenaline that had carried her through the encounter began to ebb, leaving her weak and shaky. When she finally stepped out of the car, she noticed, for the first time, that her jeans were torn at the knee, a small cut visible through the fabric. She had no memory of falling, but in the desperate rush to escape, she must have stumbled at some point. Her shirt was damp with sweat, and her hair had come loose from its practical ponytail, falling in disheveled strands around her face. Inside the station, the same ranger she'd spoken with the day before looked up from his computer, his expression shifting from professional welcome to concern as he took in her appearance. "Ms. Kim, are you all right?" "Grizzly," Lila managed, her voice sounding distant to her own ears. "In the meadow off Forest Service Road 117. It charged me. I got away, but all my equipment is still out there." Mike was on his feet immediately, guiding her to a chair. "Are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" Lila shook her head, then reconsidered as she noticed the sting from her scraped knee and a dull ache in her ankle that suggested a mild sprain. "Just some minor scrapes. I ran to my car. I didn't have time to use the bear spray." The ranger nodded, reaching for the radio on his belt. "You did the right thing. Getting to safety is the priority." He keyed the radio and spoke into it, reporting the bear sighting and Lila's encounter to what sounded like a colleague at another station. There was a brief exchange about notifying fish, wildlife, and parks, and possibly closing the trail temporarily. As Mike radioed in the details. Lila's gaze wandered around the station interior. Mounted on the walls were educational posters about local wildlife, trail maps and fire danger indicators. A glass case displayed plaster casts of animal tracks, including, she noted with a chill, the massive paw print of a grizzly bear. Her eyes lingered on the cast, remembering how those claws had slashed through her easel like it was made of paper. "Miss Kim," Mike's voice drew her attention back. "I've notified our wildlife team and they'll be investigating. In the meantime, I'd like to get some details from you about the encounter. This information helps us track bear movements and behavior patterns." He produced a form and began asking standard questions: the exact location, time of day, what the bear was doing when first sighted, whether it displayed any unusual behaviors before charging. Lila answered mechanically, the initial shock beginning to give way to a more coherent recounting of events. "And you said you were sketching the bear?" Mike asked, looking up from his form. "For how long before it charged?" "About 20 minutes, Lila admitted, suddenly feeling foolish. "It seemed calm at first. Curious but not aggressive. I kept my distance, at least 50 yards. The ranger's expression remained professional, but Lila detected a hint of disapproval. "That's closer than we recommend, especially during spring when bears are coming out of hibernation and can be particularly defensive. You're very lucky it didn't reach you." "I know," Lila said quietly. "I should have backed away immediately, but it was just so—" She struggled to find the words. "Majestic, perfect. I've never had the opportunity to sketch a grizzly from life before." Mike's expression softened slightly. "I understand the temptation. These are magnificent animals, but they're also wild predators, and this time of year they're hungry and possibly protecting cubs." He finished filling out the form and set his pen down. "Do you feel up to showing me exactly where this happened? We should retrieve your equipment if possible, and I need to post warnings for other hikers." Lila nodded, though the prospect of returning to the meadow made her stomach clench with renewed anxiety. She followed Mike to his Forest Service truck, a sturdy green vehicle with official insignia on the doors. As they drove, the ranger radioed ahead to another colleague who would meet them at the site. The Forest Service road seemed different on the return journey, more ominous, the shadows between the trees deeper and more secretive. Lila found herself scanning the roadside vegetation tensely, half expecting to see the grizzly step out in front of them. "Bear attacks are rare, you know," Mike said, perhaps sensing her unease. "In most cases, even with grizzlies, the bear is just asserting dominance or protecting territory. Actual predatory attacks, where the bear is hunting humans as prey, are extremely uncommon." "That's not very reassuring when you're the one being charged," Lila replied with a weak attempt at humor. Mike acknowledged this with a nod. "Fair enough. But understanding bear behavior can help prevent dangerous encounters. For instance, what changed just before the bear charged? Was there a shift in the wind? Did you stand up suddenly?" Lila thought back, trying to identify the trigger. "The wind did change direction. I felt it on my face, and then the bear he transformed. One minute it was calm, the next it was all aggression." "That makes sense," Mike said. "The wind probably carried your scent directly to the bear. Until then, it might not have fully registered what you were." He slowed the truck as they approached the turnout where Lila had parked earlier. And here we are. Another Forest Service vehicle was already at the site, and a uniformed ranger stood beside it, binoculars raised as he scanned the meadow. He lowered them as Mike parked alongside. "Tom," Mike acknowledged with a nod. "This is Ms. Kim, the artist who had the encounter." "Ms. Kim, this is Tom Blackfeet, one of our wildlife specialists." Tom, a Native American man with salt and pepper hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, shook Lila's hand. His grip was firm, his expression serious but kind. "Glad you made it out safely. I've been watching the meadow for about 10 minutes. No sign of the bear at the moment, but there's clear evidence it was here." He gestured toward the field where Lila's easel lay in pieces, art supplies scattered across the grass like debris after a storm. "That your equipment?" Lila nodded, her heart sinking at the sight of the destruction. The easel was beyond repair, splintered wood lying in fragments around the tattered remains of her canvas. Her wooden case of supplies had been smashed open, pencils and pastels strewn across yards of meadow. "I'd like to go out there with you to collect what's salvageable," Tom said to Mike. "Better to remove anything with human scent on it. Bears can become habituated if they associate human items with food or interesting scents." Mike agreed, and both rangers prepared to venture into the meadow. They checked their bear spray communication devices and took a moment to scan the surroundings once more before proceeding. "Ms. Kim, I'd like you to stay in the truck with the doors locked," Mike instructed. "We'll gather what we can of your supplies." Lila was more than happy to comply. From the safety of the truck cab, she watched as the two rangers cautiously approached the site of her encounter. They moved with practiced efficiency, gathering the scattered art supplies and the remains of her easel. Tom occasionally paused to examine the ground, likely reading signs invisible to Lila's untrained eye. Bear tracks, perhaps, or other evidence of the animal's passage. After about 15 minutes, they returned to the vehicles, carrying Lila's salvaged possessions. It wasn't much. A few unbroken pencils, her leather pouch of tools mostly intact if somewhat scratched, and the wooden case, cracked but still holding together. Notably absent was her sketchbook. "We couldn't find your sketchbook," Mike confirmed, as he handed over the rescued items. "Could have been carried off by the bear or blown into the forest by the wind. Sorry about that." Lila accepted the meager remains of her morning's work with a nod of thanks. The loss of the sketchbook stung more than the destruction of the more expensive easel. Those bear sketches had been some of the best work she'd done in months. Raw, immediate, charged with the energy of direct observation. And now they were gone, along with the sketchbook that contained weeks of other preliminary studies for her hotel commission. "We're going to post warning signs at all the trailheads in this area," Tom informed her, pulling a stack of bright, yellow notices from his truck. "And we'll have a team monitoring for the next few days to determine if this bear poses an ongoing threat to public safety." "What happens if you decide it does?" Lila asked, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it confirmed. Tom's expression was carefully neutral. "So that depends on several factors: the bear's history, the specifics of the encounter, whether there's a pattern of aggressive behavior. In some cases, relocation is an option. In others," he didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. "Becky." Wave of guilt washed over Lila. She'd put herself in danger through her own poor judgment, and now a wild animal might pay the ultimate price. "It was just behaving like a bear," she said quietly. "I was in its territory. I should have left as soon as I saw it." "Try not to blame yourself too much," Mike advised. "These encounters happen, even to experienced outdoors people. The important thing is that you're safe, and we now have up-to-date information about bear activity in this area that could prevent someone else from having a similar or worse experience." Tom was examining the fragments of easel they'd recovered. "You know, it's interesting. The bear destroyed your equipment but didn't consume or carry off anything except possibly the sketchbook. That suggests it wasn't hungry or seeing your belongings as potential food. More likely it was a territorial display or a response to perceived threat." Lila wasn't sure if this was meant to be reassuring, but she nodded anyway. "Small favors, I guess." The rangers finished securing the area, posting warning signs at the turnout and the nearest trail junction. They took GPS coordinates of the encounter site and photographs of the bear's tracks and claw marks on the remnants of the easel, all part of the documentation process for wildlife management. Before they left, Tom approached Lila once more. "If you're feeling up to it, it would be helpful if you could write down a detailed account of the encounter while it's still fresh in your mind. Include everything you remember about the bear's appearance and behavior. These first-hand accounts are valuable for our research and management strategies." "Of course," Lila agreed. "I can do that." And Tom added with a hint of professional curiosity, "I'd be interested to see your sketches of the bear if you ever manage to recover that sketchbook." The drive back to the ranger station was quieter than the journey out. Lila sat in the passenger seat of Mike's truck, cradling the salvaged art supplies in her lap, lost in thought. The adrenaline had fully subsided now, leaving her physically exhausted but mentally alert, her thoughts racing as she processed the morning's events. At the station, she completed the additional paperwork Tom had requested, writing a detailed account of the encounter, while Mike prepared an incident report for Fish, Wildlife and Parks. The process took nearly an hour, during which Lila drank 2 cups of strong coffee and ate a granola bar from the station's small kitchenette. "Will there be any kind of public announcement about this?" she asked as she signed the last form. Mike shook his head. "Not usually for a single encounter with no injuries. We'll post notices locally and update our website's wildlife alert section, but bear sightings themselves aren't newsworthy in this region. They're a fact of life. If the monitoring team determines this is a problem bear with a pattern of aggressive behavior, then there might be broader public notifications." Lila nodded, simultaneously relieved and a little disappointed. Part of her wanted validation of the terrifying experience she'd just survived, some public acknowledgement of her brush with death. But the larger part was grateful for the relative anonymity. She didn't want to become known as that artist who was stupid enough to sketch a charging grizzly. "Do you need a ride to a medical facility?" Mike asked as she prepared to leave. "Those scratches should probably be cleaned properly, and you're limping a bit." Lila glanced down at her torn jeans and the dried blood on her knee. Her ankle was indeed sore, but she could put weight on it without too much discomfort. "I'll be okay. I've got a first aid kit at home, and I can visit the clinic if it seems worse tomorrow. Thank you, though. At least let me give you my card," Mike insisted, handing over a simple business card with the Forest Service logo and his contact information. "If you think of anything else about the encounter, or if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to call." Lila took the card and slipped it into her pocket, alongside the crumpled remains of a tissue and a tube of lip balm. "I will, and thank you for everything." Back in her Subaru, Lila sat for a long moment before starting the engine. The events of the morning seemed almost dreamlike now, too vivid and terrifying to be real, yet undeniably so. Her scraped knee stung, her ankle throbbed, and the empty space beside her where her sketchbook should have been served as a tangible reminder of what she'd experienced. The drive back to Kalispell took about 40 minutes, during which Lila's mind continued to process the encounter in an endless loop. Each time she replayed the memory, different details stood out. The bear's breath fogging slightly in the cool morning air, the way its claws had left grooves in the earth when it charged, the perfect, terrible symmetry of its face as it had studied her across the meadow. Her apartment, when she finally reached it, offered a jarring return to normalcy. The small, one-bedroom space was exactly as she'd left it that morning. Coffee, mug in the sink, bed hastily made, a half-finished painting propped on her work table by the window. It seemed impossible that her ordinary life was continuing unchanged when she felt so fundamentally altered by what had happened. Lila showered, watching dried blood and meadow dirt swirl down the drain, then dressed her wounds with antiseptic and bandages from her first aid kit. The knee abrasion was superficial, already forming a scab. Her ankle was mildly swollen but not bruised, suggesting a strain rather than a sprain. She would need to rest it for a day or two, but it didn't require medical attention. Physically tended to, she turned to the practical considerations of her work. The hotel commission still needed to be completed, with or without her field sketches. Lila opened her laptop and wrote a brief email to her client, explaining that there would be a slight delay due to an unexpected incident during field research. She didn't provide details, merely assuring them that the finished pieces would be delivered on schedule, if perhaps a few days later than initially planned. Next, she made a list of the equipment she would need to replace. The easel was the most significant expense, followed by the lost sketchbook and the various pencils and pastels that hadn't been recovered. She had insurance that might cover some of the cost, but the deductible was high enough that it probably wasn't worth filing a claim. It was an expensive lesson in wilderness safety. As evening approached, the initial shock of the encounter began to give way to a different kind of response. Lila found herself standing at her kitchen counter, hands shaking so badly she couldn't open a can of soup for dinner. The delayed reaction hit her with unexpected force, a flood of emotions that had been held at bay by adrenaline and the practical necessities of the aftermath. She sank to the floor, back against the cabinets, and finally allowed herself to cry. The tears came in heaving sobs that left her gasping for breath, the full weight of her mortality pressing down on her as she acknowledged how close she had come to death. For several minutes, she simply sat there, releasing the fear and tension she'd been carrying since the moment the bear charged. When the storm of emotion subsided, Lila felt drained, but somehow clearer. She rose, splashed cold water on her face, and proceeded to make dinner with steadier hands. As she ate, she found her thoughts turning not just to the terror of the encounter, but to the magnificence of the bear itself, the raw power and primal beauty of the creature in its natural habitat. Without conscious decision, she found herself reaching for her spare sketchbook, a smaller, less expensive version she kept for quick studies and ideas. Working from memory, she began to reconstruct her observations of the grizzly. The initial sketches were tentative, her hand still carrying echoes of the day's trauma, but gradually her artist's discipline asserted itself. Lines became more confident, proportions more accurate, details more precise. By midnight, she had filled several pages with studies of the bear, standing, sitting, charging. None captured the immediacy of the sketches she'd lost in the meadow, but they preserved something of the encounter's essence. In the process of creation, Lila found a measure of catharsis, transforming fear into art, threat into subject. She slept fitfully that night, waking several times from dreams where she was running through endless meadows, the sound of heavy breathing always just behind her. Each time she would lie awake for a while, listening to the ordinary sounds of her apartment building, a neighbor's television, the hum of the refrigerator, distant traffic, before drifting back into uneasy slumber. Morning brought stiffness in her injured knee and ankle, but also a sense of resolve. Over coffee, Lila made a decision. She would contact the local newspaper, the Missoulian, and share her story. Not out of a desire for attention, but because her experience might serve as a cautionary tale for others who ventured into the Montana wilderness. If even one person became more careful in bear country as a result, it would be worth any embarrassment she might feel at publicly acknowledging her mistake. The Missoulian's office in Kalispell was a modest affair, occupying part of a converted warehouse downtown. Lila had called ahead and arranged to meet with a reporter named Sarah Donovan, who covered environmental and outdoor recreation stories for the paper. Sarah turned out to be a woman about Lila's age, with curly auburn hair and the practical attire of someone who spent considerable time in the field. "Thanks for coming in," Sarah greeted her, showing Lila to a small meeting room with a table, scattered with newspapers and notebooks. "We don't get many first-hand accounts of grisly encounters, at least not from people who can still tell the tale." There was a gallows humor to the comment that Lila appreciated. "I'm still processing that part myself," she admitted. "Every time I think about how close it was." Sarah nodded, understanding. "Take your time. Why don't you start at the beginning? What took you out to that particular meadow yesterday morning?" For the next hour, Lila recounted the entire experience, from her arrival at the meadow to her escape in the Subaru and the subsequent interaction with the rangers. Sarah took notes and occasionally asked clarifying questions, particularly about the bear's behavior before and during the charge. "Do you mind if I record some of this?" she asked at one point, holding up a small digital device. "Your descriptions are vivid. It would be good to capture them in your own words." Lila consented, and the interview continued, with Sarah occasionally prompting her for additional details. Toward the end, the reporter asked if Lila had any photos of the bear or the aftermath. "No photos of the bear," Lila replied. "I wasn't thinking about documentation at the time, just observation for my art. And afterward," she shrugged, "I wasn't exactly in a state to think about taking pictures." "What about your sketches?" Sarah asked. "You mentioned you were drawing the bear before it charged." "Lost in the meadow," Lila said with genuine regret. "The rangers couldn't find my sketchbook, but I did recreate some drawings from memory last night." She opened her spare sketchbook to show the studies she'd done after returning home. Sarah's eyes widened with appreciation. "These are remarkable. Would you be willing to let us use one with the article? It would add a powerful visual element to the story." Lila hesitated, caught between professional pride and personal vulnerability. The sketches were rough compared to her usual work, created under emotional duress and without reference, but they carried an authenticity that more polished work might lack. "All right," she agreed finally. "You can use this one." She indicated a charcoal drawing that captured the bear in the moment before it charged, standing at full height, with its head lowered slightly and eyes fixed on the viewer. "Perfect," Sarah said, arranging to have the page scanned before Lila left. "I think this will make for a compelling local interest story. It's timely, too, with peak tourist season approaching. A reminder about bear safety is always relevant in spring." "That's why I wanted to share it," Lila confirmed. "I made a mistake out there. If publicizing it prevents someone else from doing the same, it's worth any embarrassment." As their meeting concluded, Sarah asked one final question. "Has this experience changed how you'll approach your work in the future?" Lila considered carefully before answering. "I won't stop painting outdoors. The direct connection with the landscape is too important to my process, but I'll be more cautious, especially in bear country. And maybe," she paused, the idea crystallizing as she spoke, "maybe I'll work more from photographs for certain subjects. Some things are better appreciated from a distance." The article appeared in the Missoulian 2 days later, running on page 3 of the local section with the headline, "Artist's Close Encounter with Grizzly Serves as Reminder of Wilderness Safety." Lila's charcoal sketch was featured prominently, alongside a file photo of a grizzly bear from Glacier National Park and a map showing the approximate location of the encounter. Sarah had done a good job with the piece, Lila thought, as she read it over breakfast. The article balanced the dramatic elements of the story with practical information about bear safety and proper behavior in wildlife habitat. It included quotes from Tom Blackfeet about the importance of giving bears space, especially during spring, and statistics on bear encounters in the region. Lila's own quotes emphasized her mistakes, getting too close, allowing artistic passion to override caution, while also conveying the awe she'd felt observing such a magnificent animal in its natural environment. The article generated modest local interest. Lila received a few emails from fellow artists and outdoor enthusiasts, some sharing their own wildlife encounters, others expressing relief at her escape and appreciation for her honesty about the experience. A local outdoor equipment store owner contacted her about possibly using her bear sketches on safety pamphlets they distributed to customers, a suggestion Lila was considering. But beyond this small ripple in the community, life returned to a semblance of normalcy surprisingly quickly. Lila purchased a new easel and supplies, filed an insurance claim despite the high deductible. The agent was sympathetically impressed by her story and resumed work on the hotel commission. Her knee healed without complication, and the ankle pain subsided after a few days of rest. What didn't fade was the impact of the encounter on Lila's relationship with the landscape around her. The following weekend, she ventured out to paint, again choosing a popular lookout point with plenty of other visitors and clear sightlines in all directions. As she set up her new easel, she found herself constantly scanning the surroundings, tensing at every rustle in the underbrush or distant movement among the trees. The fear wasn't debilitating, but it was present, a low-grade vigilance that both distracted from and enhanced her awareness of the environment. Her resulting painting captured something different than her previous work, a landscape charged with potential threat as well as beauty. The wilderness portrayed not as a passive subject, but as an active presence with its own agency and power. Weeks passed, and spring gave way to early summer. Lila completed the hotel commission on time, delivering a series of landscape paintings that satisfied her clients while reflecting her evolved perspective on the Montana wilderness. She continued to paint outdoors regularly, though she now carried a whistle and 2 canisters of bear spray, and she meticulously followed all recommended safety protocols. She never again lingered to sketch when large wildlife appeared. One particularly warm afternoon in late June, Lila received an unexpected call from Mike Ellison at the ranger station. "Miss Kim, this is Mike from Forest Service. I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all," Lila replied, setting down her paintbrush. She was working on a small canvas in her apartment, a commission for a local business owner who had read the newspaper article and contacted her afterward. "What can I do for you?" "Well, this is a bit unusual," Mike said, a note of something amusement, curiosity in his voice. "A hiking group came through the station this morning. They were exploring off-trail near Elk Creek yesterday and found something I think belongs to you." Lila's heart quickened. "My sketchbook. Appears to be. Heavy paper, hardbound cover. Has your name and contact information inside the front cover." "That's it," Lila confirmed, hardly believing what she was hearing. "Is it intact?" Mike chuckled. "Mostly. It's a bit worse for wear, water damage to some pages, and it looks like something chewed on the corner, but the drawings inside are still visible. Quite good, if you don't mind my saying, especially the bear studies." "I can't believe it survived out there for a month," Lila said, already reaching for her car keys. "I'll come by the station right away if that's all right." "We're open until 5, Mike confirmed. "I'll keep it at the front desk for you." The drive to the ranger station felt both familiar and strange, a return to the starting point of an experience that had altered Lila's perception of the landscape she now called home. The June sunshine illuminated the valley in golden light, so different from the cooler, more tentative brightness of that May morning. The mountains stood as they always had, indifferent to the dramas that unfolded in their shadow. At the station, Mike greeted her with a friendly nod. "Good to see you again, Miss Kim. Under better circumstances this time." He reached beneath the counter and produced her missing sketchbook, now warped and stained, with visible teeth marks on one corner. The hikers found it about a quarter-mile from where your encounter occurred, near a game trail leading into the forest. Lila accepted the sketchbook with a sense of wonder, turning it carefully in her hands. The cover was scratched and dirty, but the elastic band that held it closed had somehow remained intact, protecting the interior pages from the worst of the elements. When she opened it, the familiar weight and texture of the paper brought a rush of emotion. The bear sketches were all there, page after page of studies capturing the grizzly from various angles. Some had water damage, the charcoal lines blurred and softened, while others remained crisp and clear. The final sketch, the one she'd been working on when the wind changed and the bear charged, was unfinished, a ghostly suggestion of form interrupted mid-creation. "These are quite impressive," Mike commented, looking over her shoulder at the drawings. "You really captured the power of the animal." "Thank you," Lila said softly, still paging through the recovered sketchbook. "I'm amazed these survived, and grateful. Nature returns things to us sometimes," Mike observed philosophically, "usually changed in some way, but recognizable." The comment resonated with Lila's own experience since the encounter. She, too, had been returned to herself changed but recognizable, more cautious perhaps, but also more attuned to the wild reality beneath the scenic beauty she had come to Montana to paint. "The bear was spotted again, by the way," Mike added, as Lila carefully placed the sketchbook in her bag. "About 2 weeks after your encounter. A wildlife biologist doing field research got some good photos from a safe distance. Appears to be a mature male, likely the same one you encountered based on markings and location." "Was he aggressive?" Lila asked, uncertain whether she wanted to know the answer. Mike shook his head. "Not toward the biologist, no. Seemed occupied with turning over rocks looking for insects and grubs. Typical spring feeding behavior. We've been monitoring, but there haven't been any other reports of charges or unusual aggression. Your encounter might have been a one-off. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong wind direction." This was reassuring in its way. The bear wasn't a vicious killer, just a wild animal responding to perceived threat in its territory. The randomness of the encounter, the specific confluence of factors that had put Lila in danger, somehow made it easier to accept. Not personal, just wilderness being wilderness. "Well, thank you for calling me about the sketchbook," Lila said, preparing to leave. "It means more than I can say to have these drawings back." "I thought it might," Mike replied with a smile. "Artists and their work, you know, like rangers and the wilderness, we get attached to what we care about." Driving home with the recovered sketchbook beside her, Lila felt a sense of completion that had been missing since the encounter. The physical evidence of her experience, both the terror and the wonder of it, had returned to her, bearing the marks of its own journey through the wilderness. That evening, she carefully removed the bear sketches from the damaged book, placing them in a portfolio for preservation. The water damage and tooth marks didn't diminish their value to her. If anything, these traces of the wild enhanced the authenticity of the work. These weren't just drawings of a bear, they were artifacts of an encounter, physical manifestations of a moment when human and wilderness had collided. Over the following months, Lila's artistic practice evolved. She continued to paint outdoors, but she also began working from photographs more frequently, particularly when depicting wildlife. The direct observation of her subjects remained important to her process, but she had gained a new respect for the boundaries between human space and wild space, and for the wisdom of maintaining those boundaries. The sketches from her bear encounter became the basis for a series of paintings that attracted attention beyond the local art scene. A gallery in Missoula exhibited the work, and a regional art magazine published a feature on Lila, focusing on how her close call with the grizzly had influenced her artistic perspective. The hotel that had commissioned her landscapes ordered additional pieces for their dining room, appreciating the subtle shift in her portrayal of the Montana wilderness, beauty tinged with awareness of hidden power. Lila never returned to that specific meadow off Forest Service Road 117, though she often thought about it. In her mind, it remained the bear's domain, a place where she had been permitted a glimpse of wild majesty before being forcefully reminded of her status as an intruder. She painted other meadows, other mountains, finding new vantage points from which to capture the landscape that continued to inspire and challenge her. Occasionally, when the light was a certain way, or when the wind carried the scent of pine and wildflowers, Lila would find herself back in that moment of perfect attention, artist and subject connected across species boundaries by the act of observation. And sometimes in dreams, she still ran through endless meadows, pursued by something large and powerful. But increasingly, the dreams ended not with terror, but with transformation. The chase becoming a dance, the threat becoming a presence, fear giving way to respect. On the anniversary of the encounter, Lila drove to a different overlook in the Flathead Valley and set up her easel as the sun rose over the mountains. From her vantage point, she could see for miles across the landscape that had become her home, a living canvas of forest, meadow, and mountain, shaped by forces both gentle and violent. She worked steadily through the morning, capturing the play of light across the terrain, occasionally pausing to scan the surroundings out of habitual caution. No bears appeared that day, but Lila felt their presence nonetheless, woven into the fabric of the wilderness, invisible but essential to its character. As she painted, she reflected on what the encounter had taught her, that beauty and danger often coexist, that respect must accompany appreciation, that wilderness remains wild even when rendered in paint and canvas. The finished landscape depicted the valley in early morning light, mist rising from the forests, mountains etched against a brightening sky. In the foreground, barely visible unless one looked closely, was the silhouette of a bear moving away through tall grass, a shadow presence acknowledging the reality that this land belonged first and always to forces older and wilder than human art or ambition. Lila titled the painting The Last Sketch and hung it in her apartment, a personal reminder of a moment when the boundary between artist and subject, between observer and observed, had momentarily dissolved, leaving behind only the raw truth of existence in a world where beauty and terror walk hand in hand and where some subjects are best appreciated from a respectful distance. Miles away in the forests east of the Flathead Valley, a grizzly bear moved through dappled sunlight, following ancient paths invisible to human eyes. It crossed a meadow where, a year earlier, it had encountered a strange two-legged creature that had fled before its charge. No memory of this event remained in the bear's consciousness, only the immediate awareness of the world around it, the scents carried on the wind, the feel of earth beneath massive paws, the endless search for food and shelter in a landscape that was neither kind nor cruel, but simply wild. The bear paused at the edge of the meadow, rising briefly on hind legs to survey its domain. Finding nothing of interest, it dropped back to all fours and continued into the forest, disappearing among the shadows of towering pines, a force of nature returning to the wilderness that had shaped it, indifferent to the human stories woven around its passage. Now let's move on to the story of the next survivor. The pre-dawn air bit at Hank Murphy's weathered face as he stepped onto the porch of his modest ranch house, coffee mug steaming in his calloused hand. At 55, Hank wore his years in the deep lines around his eyes and the permanent squint earned from decades under the Wyoming sun. The late May morning carried the familiar scent of sage and pine from the nearby forests of the Bighorn Mountains, but something else lingered beneath, a metallic hint of coming rain that made his arthritic knee ache more than usual. Hank sipped the black coffee and surveyed his property, 200 acres of rough pasture land nestled in a valley 8 miles outside of Sheridan. The eastern sky was just beginning to pale, revealing the silhouettes of his small herd of Herefords grazing in the lower pasture. His gaze drifted upward to the dark outline of the mountains that dominated the western horizon. The Bighorns had been his backdrop for 30 years, ever since he'd scraped together enough money from a decade of working other men's ranches to put a down payment on this patch of hardscrabble land. The creaking of the screen door behind him announced Martha's arrival. His wife of 28 years joined him on the porch, her own mug clutched in hands that had grown strong from ranch work despite her slight frame. At 53, Martha's auburn hair had dulled to a rust color streaked with gray, but her green eyes remained as sharp as the day they'd met at the county fair all those years ago. "Thought I heard you get up," she said, leaning against the porch railing beside him. "Another early start?" Hank nodded, taking another sip of coffee. "Need to ride out to the north pasture today. Been meaning to check that fence line where it meets Taylor's property. And Bill Erickson called last night after you went to bed. Said he spotted some bear sign up near his place." Martha's eyebrows rose slightly. "Grizzly? That's what he thinks. Said the game warden confirmed a sow with 2 yearlings has been working that area. Probably just passing through, but I want to make sure our calves are all accounted for. Take the rifle, Martha said. It wasn't a suggestion. Hank nodded, his eyes still fixed on the mountains. Grizzlies weren't uncommon in the Bighorns, but they typically kept to the higher elevations. In his 3 decades on this ranch, he'd only had to deal with 3 bear encounters, all black bears, and none had resulted in livestock loss. But grizzlies were different, larger, more aggressive, and far less predictable. A hungry sow with cubs would attack anything she perceived as a threat or a meal. I was thinking of taking the 4-wheeler instead of Rusty, Hank said, referring to his aging quarter horse. Cover more ground that way. Martha nodded and patted his shoulder before turning back toward the door. I'll pack you a lunch. And don't forget your cell phone this time. Hank grunted acknowledgement as she disappeared inside. The phone was a relatively new addition to his daily gear, purchased at Martha's insistence after he'd thrown a shoulder out of joint last winter while working alone in the barn. Reception was spotty at best out here, but it gave Martha peace of mind. As the sun finally crested the eastern horizon, Hank drained the last of his coffee and went inside to prepare for the day. In the kitchen, Martha was assembling sandwiches, while their border collie, Gage, watched hopefully from his spot near the wood stove. The warmth from the stove had taken the early morning chill from the house, and the familiar smells of bacon and biscuits from breakfast still lingered. Hank moved to the mudroom off the kitchen, where his work gear hung on pegs beside the door. He pulled on his worn Carhartt jacket and reached for his wide-brimmed hat, a necessity against both sun and rain in Wyoming's unpredictable spring weather. From the gun cabinet in the corner, he retrieved his Remington 30 Aero 6, checking that it was loaded before slipping it into the scabbard he'd carry on the 4-wheeler. As an afterthought, he grabbed the flare gun from the shelf above, a leftover from his day's working search and rescue with the county sheriff's department. Bear spray was more conventional, but the flare gun had saved his hide once before when a black bear had been too interested in his hunting camp 5 years back. The bright flare and loud report had sent the bear scrambling without the risk of an injured, angry animal that sometimes came with using a firearm. Martha handed him a paper bag containing his lunch and a thermos of coffee. "Be careful out there," she said, her everyday goodbye carrying a bit more weight than usual. "Always am," Hank replied, giving her a quick peck on the cheek. He bent down to ruffle Gage's ears. "You stay and keep an eye on things here, buddy." The collie whined, always eager to accompany Hank on his rounds. But today, Hank wanted speed and mobility without having to worry about the dog. Outside, the morning had warmed slightly, but dark clouds massing to the west suggested the fine weather wouldn't last. Hank made his way to the equipment shed where his red Honda 4-wheeler waited. After securing his rifle in the scabbard, mounted to the side and the flare gun in the storage compartment under the seat, he started the engine and headed toward the north pasture. The ranch road was rutted from recent spring rains, forcing Hank to take it slower than he'd like. He passed the main cattle pens and barn, where his part-time ranch hand, Miguel Rodriguez, was already at work mucking out stalls. Miguel, a stocky man in his 30s, who'd been working for Hank for the past 5 years, raised a hand in greeting as Hank passed. "Checking the north fence today," Hank called out over the engine's rumble. "Be back this afternoon." Miguel nodded. "Want me to ride up and give you a hand after I finish here?" Hank considered it for a moment, then shook his head. "Nah, just keep an eye on things here. Martha might need help with those fence posts she wanted to paint." As Hank continued north, the relatively flat ground of the home pasture gave way to increasingly rugged terrain. The north pasture lay in a natural bowl, surrounded by pine-covered slopes that marked the beginning of the foothills. It was prime, grazing land, with a small creek running through it providing water for the 20 head of cattle currently occupying it, including several cows with young calves at their sides. The 4-wheeler bumped along the uneven ground as Hank followed the fence line, stopping occasionally to inspect damaged posts or sagging wire. The work was routine, methodical, allowing his mind to wander as his hands tightened wires and hammered staples. Despite the modern conveniences that had found their way onto his ranch over the years, the ATVs, the cell phones, the electric fence chargers, there was still something deeply satisfying about working with his hands, making tangible repairs to the physical boundaries of his livelihood. By mid-morning, Hank had worked his way around to the northwestern corner of his property, where his land butted up against national forest. This was where Bill Erickson had reported seeing bear sign, and Hank kept a sharper eye on his surroundings as he worked. The cattle seemed calm enough, grazing peacefully in small groups across the pasture, but Hank knew that could change in an instant if a predator appeared. As he neared the tree line, Hank cut the engine and dismounted, deciding to check the fence where it disappeared into the forest on foot. He retrieved his rifle from the scabbard, slinging it over his shoulder, and patted the flare gun in his jacket pocket. The forest was quiet as he approached, the only sounds the gentle rustling of pine needles in the breeze and the distant call of a Stella's jay. 20 yards into the trees, Hank found what he'd been half expecting and wholly dreading. The fence had been damaged, with 2 posts pushed over and the wire between them snapped. Around the damaged site, the ground was torn, up with tracks that Hank immediately recognized as grizzly. From the size of the prints, nearly the length of his hand, it was a large bear, likely a male and not the sow with cubs that Bill had mentioned. "Damn," Hank muttered, crouching to examine the tracks more closely. They were fresh, probably, from some time during the night. The bear had come from the forest, crossed through the damaged fence and headed in the direction of the grazing cattle. Hank scanned the pasture with renewed concern, but the herd seemed undisturbed. If the bear had approached them, it hadn't caused enough alarm to scatter them. Standing, Hank debated his next move. He could repair the fence now, but if the bear was still in the vicinity, it would likely just break through again. Better to track it, make sure it had moved on, and then come back with Miguel tomorrow to make a more substantial repair, perhaps adding some electric wire as a deterrent. Keeping his rifle at the ready, Hank began following the tracks. They led from the fence back toward the creek that ran through the north pasture. The bear had moved with purpose, its stride long and direct. At the creek, the tracks followed the muddy bank for nearly a quarter-mile before veering back toward the forest on the eastern edge of the pasture. Hank followed cautiously, all senses alert for any sign of the grizzly. The tracks led to another section of fence, this one still intact. The bear had apparently climbed over rather than through, leaving tufts of brown fur caught on the barbed wire. Beyond the fence, the tracks continued into a dense stand of aspens that marked the beginning of a ravine leading up into the mountains. Hank paused at the fence line, considering. The smart move would be to turn back now, report the bear, sign to the game warden, and keep a close eye on the herd for the next few days. But there was another pasture beyond the aspen grove, where he kept another 15 head, including some of his best breeding stock. If the bear was heading in that direction, decision made, Hank carefully climbed through the fence and continued tracking. The ravine narrowed as he moved deeper into the trees, the ground rising steadily. The bear tracks remained clear in the soft earth, heading upward. Hank moved slowly, stopping often to listen and scan his surroundings. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. He was being foolish, tracking a grizzly alone like this, especially one that had shown interest in his cattle. But his concern for his livestock outweighed his caution. The ravine opened up into a small clearing, and there Hank froze. On the far side, not 30 yards away, stood the grizzly. It was enormous, at least 8 feet tall as it stood on its hind legs, its massive head swinging from side to side as it scented the air. Its fur was dark brown, almost black in places, with the characteristic silver-tipped hairs that gave grizzlies their name scattered across its shoulders and back. Time seemed to stop as Hank stood motionless, barely breathing. The bear hadn't spotted him yet, its poor eyesight a momentary advantage, but Hank knew the grizzly's sense of smell would soon alert it to his presence, especially if the wind shifted. Slowly, he began to back away, placing each foot with deliberate care to avoid making noise. He'd retreated perhaps 10 feet when his boot came down on a fallen branch. The crack seemed deafening in the quiet clearing. The bear's head swung toward him instantly, small eyes fixing on him with unnerving intelligence. For a heartbeat, neither man nor beast moved. Then the grizzly dropped to all fours and began moving toward him, not charging but approaching with determined curiosity. Hank's hand moved to his rifle, but he hesitated. Shooting a grizzly was a last resort, and without an immediate threat, could bring legal consequences. Instead, he reached for the flare gun in his pocket. If he could scare the bear off without harming it, that would be the ideal outcome. "Hey!" Hank shouted, making himself as large as possible by spreading his arms. "Get out of here!" The bear paused, tilting its head slightly as if considering this strange creature making noise at it. Then it resumed its approach, more purposeful now. Hank could see its muscles bunching beneath its thick fur, its massive paws leaving deep impressions. in the earth with each step. When the bear was 20 yards away, Hank raised the flare gun and fired. The bright red projectile arced just over the grizzly's head, illuminating the clearing with an eerie glow as it hissed and sputtered in the vegetation beyond. The noise and light had the desired effect. The bear flinched and turned, lumbering quickly back toward the far side of the clearing and disappearing into the trees. Hank exhaled shakily, suddenly aware that he'd been holding his breath. He waited a few minutes, making sure the bear wasn't circling back, then retreated the way he'd come, moving as quickly as he dared while still keeping alert. Only when he reached the fence line and crossed back onto his pasture did he allow himself to relax slightly. Back at the four-wheeler, Hank took out his cell phone, intent on calling the game warden to report the bear. As expected, there was no signal this far out. He'd have to wait until he returned to the ranch house. Starting the engine, he took one last look at the damaged fence, then turned the vehicle toward home. The clouds that had been threatening all morning finally made good on their promise as Hank rode back. A light rain began to fall, quickly becoming a steady downpour that soaked through his jacket. By the time he reached the ranch house, he was thoroughly drenched and chilled, his earlier adrenaline long since faded. Martha met him at the door with a towel and concern in her eyes. "You're soaked through. Did you fix the fence?" Hank shook his head, wiping rain from his face. "Found bear sign, just like Bill said. But it's not the sow and cubs. It's a big male. Broke through the fence near the north woods." Martha's expression tightened. "Did you see it?" "Yeah," Hank said, hanging his wet jacket on a peg and placing his rifle back in the cabinet. "Had to use the flare gun to scare it off. It was getting too curious for comfort." "Hank Murphy," Martha said with the exasperated tone she reserved for when she thought he'd taken unnecessary risks. "You know better than to approach a grizzly alone." "Didn't exactly approach it," Hank defended himself as he sat at the kitchen table and pulled off his wet boots. "Was tracking it to make sure it wasn't heading for the east pasture, and there it was. Don't worry, I kept my distance." Martha put a mug of hot coffee in front of him, then sat across the table. "You calling Steve about it?" Steve Newell was the local game warden, a younger man whom Hanky had known since Steve was a boy hunting with his father on neighboring land. They had a good relationship, built on mutual respect and a shared concern for balancing the needs of wildlife with those of the people who made their living from the land. "Yeah, going to call him once I warm up a bit," Hank said, wrapping his hands around the hot mug. "Might need to move those cattle from the north pasture if the bear's getting comfortable there." Martha nodded, then stood as the phone in the kitchen rang. She answered, listened for a moment, then handed it to Hank. "Speak of the devil," she said. "It's Steve." Hank took the receiver. "Hey, Steve. Was just about to call you. Let me guess." Steve's voice came through clearly, despite the increasing patter of rain on the roof. "You've got bear trouble too." "Two? So I'm not the first?" "No, you're about the fourth call I've had today. The Johnsons lost 2 calves last night, and Bill Erickson found one of his steers dead this morning. Tom Harper hasn't lost any livestock yet, but he's got tracks all through his west field." Hank frowned. "That's a lot of activity for one bear." "Might not be just one," Steve replied. "We've got at least the sow with cubs that I told Bill about, plus possibly 2 adult males based on the track sizes I've seen. It's unusual to have this many grizzlies down this low, especially getting this bold around livestock." "What's your plan?" Hank asked, knowing that the game warden would already be formulating a response. "I've got a team from the state wildlife department coming tomorrow with some traps. We'll try to relocate any we catch. In the meantime, I'd recommend bringing in any livestock that's particularly vulnerable, calves especially." Hank considered this. The north pasture had 6 cows with young calves, too many to bring into the barn. "I'll see what I can do," he said noncommittally. "I'm more concerned about that big male I saw today. He broke right through my fence." Steve didn't even try to go around it. There was a pause on the line. "How big are we talking?" "Biggest I've ever seen around here. 8 feet easy when he stood up. Dark coat, silver-tipped, and not afraid of me at all until I fired the flare." "Gun?" Another pause. "That sounds like the one the Johnsons described. Look, Hank, be extra careful with this one. A bear that size that's already associating ranches with food could be a real problem. I'd feel better if you could get those calves somewhere more secure." "I'll do what I can," Hank promised. "You'll let me know when your wildlife folks are setting traps?" "First thing tomorrow," Steve assured him, and Hank Thanks for using the flare gun instead of shooting it. Makes my job a lot easier. After hanging up, Hank explained the conversation to Martha, who looked increasingly worried. If it killed calves at the Johnsons, it could come back for ours, she said. I know, Hank agreed, but moving them all to the home pasture would put too much pressure on the grass there, especially with the dry summer they're predicting. He thought for a moment. I'll take Miguel and move the cows with calves to the east pasture. It's smaller, easier to monitor, and farther from the woods. We can keep the others where they are for now. Martha nodded, though she still looked concerned. Just be careful, that bear sounds dangerous. They're all dangerous, Hank replied, finishing his coffee and standing. That's why we respect them and keep our distance. I'll call Miguel and see if he can help me move those cattle this afternoon. Miguel was more than willing to help, and by late afternoon, despite the continuing rain, they had successfully moved the 6 cows and their calves to the east pasture. The work was muddy and challenging. Cattle never moved as smoothly as one hoped, but having the experienced ranch hands' help made it possible. Miguel, like many in the area, had his own stories of bear encounters, though none as close as Hank's. Morning experience. My cousin in Montana, he lost 3 calves to a grizzly last year, Miguel said as they rode back to the ranch house, both soaked and mud-splattered. Had to sleep in his truck with a spotlight for a week before the wardens finally trapped it. Hank nodded grimly. Let's hope it doesn't come to that. Steve said they're bringing traps tomorrow. Those traps, they don't always work, Miguel observed. Bears are smart, you know, especially the old ones. The rain finally stopped as evening approached, though the sky remained overcast. After thanking Miguel and sending him home to his family in town, Hank took a long hot shower, trying to ease the ache in his muscles from the day's work. Dinner was quiet, both he and Martha preoccupied with thoughts of the bear situation. After they'd eaten, Hank called his nearest neighbors who hadn't already spoken to Steve, warning them about the grizzly sightings. Jim Taylor, whose property bordered Hank's to the north, was particularly concerned. Got my grandkids visiting next week, he said. Might have to rethink letting them camp out in the yard like I promised. Probably wise, Hank agreed, at least until the wardens get this situation under control. That night, Hank slept fitfully, his dreams filled with massive shadowy bears moving through his pastures. He woke before dawn, as was his habit, but feeling far from rested. Martha slept on as he dressed quietly and made his way to the kitchen to start coffee. Gage greeted him with a soft whine, and Hank let the dog out onto the porch, watching as the border collie trotted down to the yard to do his morning business. Something felt off as Hank stood on the porch, coffee in hand. The pre-dawn was quieter than usual, no birdsong greeting the imminent sunrise. Gage had stopped in the middle of the yard, his posture alert, nose pointing toward the barn. A prickle of unease ran down Hank's spine. Gage, he called softly, get back here. The collie ignored him, taking a step toward whatever had caught his attention. Then Hank saw it, a massive dark shape moving along the edge of the barn. The grizzly it had followed him home. Gage! Hank called more urgently. Come! This time the dog responded, backing toward the porch while still facing the bear. Hank set his coffee down and quickly went inside, returning moments later with his rifle. The bear had emerged fully from behind the barn now and was moving with purpose toward the smaller pasture where they kept a few horses. Rusty, Hank's quarter horse, and Martha's paint mare Daisy were visible in the growing light, still unaware of the predator approaching their fence. Hank raised his rifle but hesitated. The shot would need to be perfect to stop a grizzly that size, and at this distance in the dim light, he couldn't guarantee it. A wounded bear would be infinitely more dangerous than one merely passing through. And if the bear wasn't directly threatening livestock or humans, shooting it would still bring legal complications. Instead, Hank fired a shot into the air. The crack echoed across the ranch, and the bear immediately stopped, swinging its head toward the source of the noise. The horses in the pasture finally noticed the grizzly and panicked, galloping to the far end of their enclosure with alarmed whinnies. The bear seemed undecided for a moment, then turned and lumbered toward the tree line at the edge of the property, disappearing into the shadows. Hank kept his rifle ready, watching to ensure the bear didn't return. After several minutes, he lowered the weapon, exhaling slowly. The screen door opened behind him as Martha emerged, tying her robe around her. Was that a shot? What's happening? Our grizzly friend paid us a visit, Hank said, his voice tense. He was heading for the horses, fired a warning shot, and he took off. Martha's face paled. It came all the way to the house? Hank, that's not normal behavior. No, it's not, Hank agreed grimly. I'm calling Steve right now. Steve answered on the third ring, sounding like he'd already been awake. Let me guess, he said after Hank identified himself. You've had another bear sighting. In my front yard this time, Hank confirmed. Just now heading for my horses. I fired a warning shot and he retreated. But Steve, this isn't good. That bear traveled at least 5 miles from where I saw him yesterday, directly to my ranch. Damn, Steve muttered. The wildlife team is meeting me in town at 7. I'll have them come to your place first. Can you keep an eye out until we get? There should be no more than 2 hours. I'll be watching, Hank promised. But Steve, this bear is getting bolder. Warning shots might not work next time. I understand, Steve said, his tone serious. Do what you need to do to protect yourself and your animals, Hank. Just document everything if you can. After hanging up, Hank turned to Martha. They'll be here in a couple of hours. I'm going to check on the cattle in the east pasture, make sure they're okay. Martha nodded, her expression tight with worry. Take your phone and be careful, Hank. That bear could still be around. Hank made quick work of saddling Rusty, deciding that the horse's superior vantage point and instincts would be valuable if the bear was still in the area. The quarter horse was skittish at first, still spooked from the earlier encounter, but settled under Hank's familiar handling. With his rifle secured in the saddle scabbard and the flare gun in his jacket pocket, Hank rode out toward the east pasture as the sun finally broke over the horizon. The morning was clear and cool after the previous day's rain, the mountains sharp against the blue sky. Under different circumstances, Hank would have enjoyed the ride, but today, every shadow among the trees made him tense, every unusual sound causing Rusty to prick his ears forward nervously. The cattle in the east pasture appeared undisturbed, the cows grazing peacefully with their calves nearby. Hank rode the perimeter, checking the fence line and scanning for any sign of bear activity. Finding nothing concerning, he was about to head back to the ranch house when his cell phone rang. It was Miguel. Mr. Murphy. The ranch hand's voice was tight with tension. You better come to the north pasture. We've got trouble. What kind of trouble? Hank asked, though he already suspected the answer. It's the bear. Got one of the steers. It's... Miguel paused. It's not good, boss. I'll be right there, Hank said, turning Rusty toward the north pasture. Don't approach it if the bear's still around. No bear now, Miguel assured him, but it was here not long ago. The kill is fresh. It took Hank 15 minutes of hard riding to reach the north pasture. He found Miguel on horseback near the western edge, close to where Hank had tracked the bear the previous day. The ranch hand's face was grim as he pointed toward a depression in the ground where a small seasonal stream created a natural draw. Even from a distance, Hank could see the dark mass of the downed steer. As he rode closer, the extent of the damage became clear. The 2-year-old Hereford had been partially consumed, its abdomen torn open and much of its hindquarters devoured. The ground around the carcass was churned up with massive paw prints and blood-soaked earth. Found it when I was checking the herd this morning, Miguel explained, his eyes never leaving the gruesome scene. Must have happened during the night or early morning. This is a big animal to take down, Mr. Murphy. Not a typical bear kill. Hank dismounted, approaching the carcass carefully. No, it's not, he agreed. Grizzlies don't usually go after full-grown cattle unless there's something wrong with the bear. He examined the tracks surrounding the kill site. Same bear that I saw yesterday has to be from the size of these prints. Miguel crossed himself quickly. A problem bear, he said quietly. My father would say it has tasted cattle now. It will want more. Hank couldn't argue with the traditional wisdom. A bear that had successfully killed large livestock would indeed be likely to try again. This was no longer just a curious grizzly passing through. It was a direct threat to his livelihood. Steve Newell and some wildlife officers are coming to the ranch this morning, Hank said. We need to document this before they arrive. Got your phone on you? Miguel nodded, taking out his smartphone and snapping several photos of the kill site, the tracks and the carcass from multiple angles. Hank, meanwhile, examined the surrounding area more carefully, trying to determine how the attack had played out. From the sign, it appeared the bear had approached from the tree line, probably under cover of darkness. The steer had been separated from the main herd, perhaps already injured or sick, making it an easier target. There were signs of a brief struggle, gouges in the earth where the steer had tried to flee, but the bear's overwhelming strength had quickly prevailed. The wildlife folks will want to see this, Hank said, returning to Rusty. But I need to get back to the house to meet them. Can you stay here, keep an eye on things? I don't want the bear coming back while they're setting traps. Miguel nodded, though he looked less than thrilled at the prospect of bear-watching duty. I'll stay. On horseback, he said. Trigger has a good nose for predators. He patted his bay gelding's neck reassuringly. I'll send one of the wildlife officers out as soon as they arrive, Hank promised, mounting Rusty again. And Miguel, keep your rifle ready. If that bear comes back and acts aggressive, don't hesitate. The ride back to the ranch house was tense, Hank constantly scanning his surroundings for any sign of the grizzly. The bear's behavior was concerning, first approaching his house and horses at dawn, then killing a full-grown steer. Either it was desperately hungry, sick, or had developed a dangerous lack of fear toward humans and their livestock. None of these possibilities boded well. As Hank rode into the yard, he spotted a Wyoming Game and Fish Department truck parked next to the house, along with Steve Newell's familiar Green Warden's vehicle. 3 men stood talking with Martha on the porch. Steve and 2 others Hank didn't recognize, likely the wildlife specialists. Steve raised a hand in greeting as Hank dismounted and tied Rusty to the hitching post. Morning, Hank. This is Mike Callahan and Dave Benson from the large carnivore management team. The 2 men nodded in greeting. One was tall and lanky, with a salt and pepper beard, the other shorter and stockier, with the weathered look of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. Glad you're here, Hank said, shaking their hands briefly. We've got a situation. Just found one of my steers killed in the north pasture. Same bear that was here at dawn, I'd bet my boots on it. The wildlife officers exchanged glances. Can you show us? The taller one, Mike, asked. My ranch hand Miguel is still out there keeping watch. I can take you, Hank offered. It's about 2 miles from here. 20 minutes later, the 4 men were examining the kill site, with Miguel keeping a watchful eye from a short distance away. The wildlife officers were thorough, taking measurements of the tracks, collecting hair samples from the surrounding vegetation, and photographing everything extensively. Their expressions grew increasingly serious as they worked. No doubt it's a grizzly, Dave said, straightening up from examining the carcass. Male, very large based on the track size and stride length. The attack pattern is consistent with predatory behavior, not defensive. What does that mean for us? Hank asked, though he suspected he already knew. Steve and the wildlife officers shared another look before Mike answered. It means we're dealing with a bear that's actively hunting livestock. Given that it approached your house this morning and has killed at least 1 steer that we know of, we're classifying it as a problem bear requiring immediate intervention. You're going to try to trap and relocate it? Hank asked. Dave nodded. That's the first option. We've brought 2 culvert traps. We'll set them up near this kill site, and along that game trail we spotted leading to your east pasture. If we can catch it, we'll move it far up into the Absaroka range, well away from ranches. And if you can't catch it, Hank pressed. Steve answered this time. If it continues to be a threat and can't be trapped, we may have to consider lethal removal. But that's a last resort, Hank. These bears are still a protected species, despite being delisted from the endangered list. Hank understood the delicate balance the wildlife officers were trying to maintain. Grizzlies had made a remarkable comeback in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem after nearly being wiped out, and each bear was still considered valuable to the recovering population. But that conservation success story provided little comfort when one of those recovering predators was threatening his livelihood and potentially his family's safety. I respect what you're trying to do, Hank said carefully, but that bear was within 100 yards of my house this morning, heading for my horses. If it comes back and threatens my family, I'm not going to wait for a trap to work. That's understood, Mike said, his tone conciliatory. Wyoming law allows you to protect yourself, your family, and your livestock from immediate threat. We're just asking that you give the traps a chance to work first. They spent the next 2 hours setting up the traps, large metal culverts with doors designed to drop shut when a bear entered, to investigate the bait inside. One was positioned near the kill site, using the scent of the dead steer as additional attraction. The other was placed along the game trail leading toward the east pasture, baited with a concoction that smelled like rotting meat and fish oil, appealing to a bear, revolting to humans. We'll check these twice daily, Dave explained, as they finish setting the last trap, and we'll have a team ready to respond immediately if we catch him. In the meantime, I'd recommend keeping your livestock as close to the ranch buildings as possible, and don't let anyone go out alone, especially at dawn or dusk. Hank nodded, though he knew these precautions would significantly complicate ranch operations. May was a busy time, with carving finished but fencing, branding, and pasture rotation all needing attention before the summer heat set in. As they rode back to the ranch house, Steve hung back to ride alongside Hank. "I've heard reports of 3 different grizzlies in this area in the past week," he said quietly. "That's unusual this low in the foothills. Something's driving them down from their normal range." "Food shortage up high?" Hank suggested. "Possibly. The late spring might have delayed some of their natural food sources, or it could be competition from other bears, maybe even wolf pressure in some areas. Whatever it is, we need to be extra vigilant until they move back to their usual territory." The rest of the day passed without further bear sightings, though Hank remained on edge. He and Miguel reinforced the fences around the home pasture and moved the remaining horses from their paddock to the more secure corral near the barn. Martha, meanwhile, called neighbors to update them on the situation and the location of the traps. That evening, several neighbors came by to discuss the bear situation. Bill Erickson, Jim Taylor, and Tom Harper sat around Hank's kitchen table, each with their own encounter stories and concerns. Tom, a retired Forest Service ranger turned small-scale rancher, had the most experience with grizzlies. "This behavior isn't normal," he said after hearing about the steer killing and the bear's approach to Hank's house. "A bear that's lost its fear of humans and developed a taste for livestock is dangerous. I've seen it before, up in Glacier. Usually it's a bear that's either been injured so it can't hunt normally, or one that's been inadvertently fed by humans." "You think someone's been feeding this one?" Jim asked skeptically. Tom shrugged. "Not deliberately, maybe. But bears get into garbage, pet food, bird feeders. Once they associate human places with easy meals, it's a short step to livestock." "Whatever the reason," Bill interjected, "I'm keeping my rifle a lot closer until they catch this thing." "Got he. My daughter and her kids staying with me, and I'm not taking any chances." The men nodded in agreement. Despite the official protocols and the wildlife team's efforts, each would do what was necessary to protect their families and livelihoods. It was the unspoken reality of living in grizzly country. Respect for the magnificent predators ran deep, but so did the imperative to survive. As the neighbors departed with promises to keep each other informed of any bear activity, Hank found himself restless. The spring night was cool but clear, a 3/4 moon casting enough light to illuminate the yard and nearby fields. He stood on the porch long after Martha had gone to bed, scanning the silvery landscape for any sign of movement. Gage sat beside him, the collie unusually subdued, as if sensing Hank's tension. Eventually, fatigue overtook vigilance, and Hank went inside, double-checking the locks on the doors, a habit rarely observed in rural Wyoming, but suddenly seeming prudent. Before heading to bed, he made sure his rifle was loaded and within easy reach, and placed the flare gun on his bedside table. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by every creak of the old house and each distant sound from outside. Sometime in the wee, early morning hours, Hank finally fell into a deeper sleep, only to be jolted awake by Gage's frantic barking. The bedside clock read 4:17 a.m. Hank was instantly alert, grabbing his rifle and moving quickly to the window. In the fading moonlight, he could see Gage on the porch barking furiously toward the barn. For a few heart-pounding seconds, Hank could detect nothing amiss. Then he saw it, the unmistakable hulking shape of the grizzly, moving with surprising stealth along the fence line of the horse corral. "Martha," Hank said urgently, shaking his wife awake. "The bear's back. Call Steve." Without waiting for a response, Hank pulled on his jeans and boots, grabbed the flare gun from the bedside table, and headed for the door, rifle in hand. Behind him, he heard Martha reaching for the phone as she switched on the bedside lamp. Gage continued his alarm as Hank stepped onto the porch, his barking reaching a fever pitch. The border collie was smart enough to stay on the porch rather than charging the predator, but his barking had alerted the bear to their presence. The grizzly had stopped its approach to the corral and was now facing the house, its massive head swinging from side to side as it assessed this new development. "Get back inside, Gage," Hank commanded, but the dog ignored him, too focused on the threat before them. The horses in the corral had finally noticed the bear and were panicking, rushing back and forth along the fence line in their distress. The commotion seemed to trigger something in the grizzly. Rather than retreating as it had the previous morning, it rose onto its hind legs, towering to its full impressive height, and let out a deep, rumbling growl that Hank felt more than heard. Raising his rifle, Hank aimed carefully, but hesitated. The bear wasn't directly threatening him yet, and despite its proximity to the horses, it hadn't breached the corral. The wildlife officer's words echoed in his mind. Give the traps a chance to work. Avoid lethal action if possible. But the bear's behavior was becoming increasingly bold and unpredictable. Instead of firing the rifle, Hank reached for the flare gun. The bright light and noise had deterred the bear once before. Perhaps it would work again. He fired, the red flare arcing through the pre-dawn darkness and landing behind the grizzly with a sizzling hiss of illumination. The sudden light and noise startled the bear, causing it to drop to all fours again. But instead of fleeing as it had in the forest, it seemed agitated by the flare, pacing back and forth and woofing, the distinctive sound grizzlies made when annoyed or warning of an attack. Hank's stomach tightened as he realized the flare wasn't going to work this time. The bear had already experienced it once and had apparently decided it wasn't a genuine threat. Worse, the bright light had destroyed Hank's night vision, making it harder to track the bear's movements precisely. "Hank!" Martha called from the doorway behind him. "Steve's on his way with the wildlife team. He says stay inside." "Get back in the house," Hank replied, not taking his eyes off the bear, "and keep Gage with you." The bear was moving again, but not retreating. Instead, it was circling toward the side of the corral as if looking for a way in. The horses were still panicking, and Hank worried they might injure themselves in their terror. He needed to drive the bear off now, before the situation escalated further. Taking careful aim with his rifle, Hank fired a shot into the ground several yards in front of the bear. The report cracked through the morning stillness, and dirt sprayed up where the bullet struck. This had a more pronounced effect than the flare. The grizzly flinched back, then turned and lumbered toward the tree line at the edge of the property. Hank kept his rifle trained on the retreating form until it disappeared into the shadows. Only then did he lower the weapon, his heart still pounding. Martha appeared at his side, Gage held firmly by his collar. "It's gone for now," Hank said, though he didn't feel particularly reassured by this fact. The bear's return to his property, so soon after its previous visit and with increasing boldness, suggested it was developing a dangerous fixation on his ranch. "Steve said they'll be here within 30 minutes, Martha said, her voice tight with tension. "He said the trap by your kill site had been disturbed last night, but the bear somehow triggered it without getting caught." Hank nodded grimly. "This one's smart, and it's getting more comfortable around humans, which is never good." They waited on the porch as the sky gradually lightened with approaching dawn. True to his word, Steve arrived less than half an hour later, accompanied by Mike from the wildlife team. Both men looked tired, suggesting they'd been up for much. "So of the night." "Got your message," Steve said as he climbed the porch steps. "Bear came back, huh?" Hank nodded, describing the encounter in detail. Mike listened intently, taking notes on a small pad. "You did the right thing," Mike assured him. When Hank had finished, "Warning shots are appropriate when there's no immediate threat to human life, and it sounds like the bear still has enough wariness to retreat when directly confronted." "But it came back," Hank pointed out. "Twice now, to the same place. And it wasn't afraid of the flare this time." Mike nodded, his expression serious. "That is concerning. It suggests habituation to human deterrence, which is a red flag for potential problem behavior." "So what's the plan now?" Hank asked. "We're going to reset the trap that was triggered and add a third one closer to your house," Steve explained. "Dave's bringing it up now. We'll also have a team patrolling the area tonight with spotlights and noise deterrents." Hank wasn't entirely convinced these measures would be sufficient, but he nodded anyway. As the morning progressed, the wildlife team worked to set up the additional trap and reset the one that had been disturbed. Hank, meanwhile, called Miguel and asked him to come in early. There was safety in numbers when working outside today. By mid-morning, the traps were set and the wildlife team had departed, promising to return in the evening for the night patrol. Hank and Miguel spent the day keeping the livestock close, working in pairs, and maintaining vigilant watch for any sign of the bear. The day passed without incident, though the atmosphere of tension never fully dissipated. As dusk approached, Steve returned with Dave and two other wildlife officers Hank hadn't met before. They were equipped with powerful spotlights, air horns, and beanbag rounds for their shotguns, non-lethal deterrents designed to drive the bear away if it returned. They planned to patrol the perimeter of Hank's property through the night, focusing on the areas where the bear had previously appeared. Hank and Martha ate dinner with the window shades drawn that night, the unusual precaution a testament to their unease. Occasionally, they could hear the wildlife officer's truck passing along the edge of their property, the beam of the spotlight sweeping across the fields and forest edge. "This can't go on indefinitely," Martha said as they washed dishes together afterward. "They can't patrol every night, and we can't keep all the cattle penned up near the house forever." "I know," Hank agreed, "but let's give their plan a chance to work. If they can catch it and relocate it, that's the best outcome for everyone." Martha didn't look convinced, but she nodded anyway. Years of ranch life had taught them both that nature sometimes forced hard choices, and that theoretical ideals often gave way to practical necessities when livelihood and safety were at stake. That night, Hank slept better knowing the wildlife team was patrolling, though he still kept his rifle and the flare gun close at hand. Morning came without incident. No bear sightings, no cattle losses, no triggered traps. When Steve stopped by to check in, his cautious optimism was evident. "Maybe the increased activity around here has pushed it to find easier pickings elsewhere," he suggested. "Bears generally follow the path of least resistance when it comes to food sources." Hank wasn't so sure, but he kept his doubts to himself. The day progressed normally, the rhythm of ranch work providing a welcome distraction from bear concerns. By late afternoon, he was replacing a section of fence along the south pasture, while Miguel mended tack in the barn. Martha had driven into town for supplies and to update their neighbors on the situation in person. The first hint that something was wrong came when Gage, who had been napping in a patch of sun near where Hank was working, suddenly raised his head and growled low. In his throat, the border collie was staring intently toward the east pasture, his body tense and alert. Hank straightened, his hand automatically going to the rifle he'd propped against the fence post. The sun was still high in the western sky, unusual for a bear to be active at this time of day. But there it was, the grizzly moving with purpose along the tree line that bordered the east pasture. The bear was heading toward the cattle gathered at the small pond on the far side of the field. Hank raised his rifle, but he was too far away for an effective shot, and the risk of hitting one of his cattle was too great. He considered firing. Another warning shot, but something told him that wouldn't deter this bear anymore. It was time for a different approach. "Stay, Gage," he commanded firmly, then jogged toward the ATV he'd parked nearby. The four-wheeler would let him reach the pasture quickly, potentially allowing him to interpose himself between the bear and the cattle. He secured his rifle in the scabbard and checked that the flare gun was in his jacket pocket before starting the engine. As Hank raced across his property, he pulled out his cell phone and tried calling Steve, but the call wouldn't connect. No signal out here as usual. He'd have to handle this situation himself, at least initially. The bear had already entered the pasture and was moving steadily toward the cattle, which had finally noticed the predator and were beginning to show signs of alarm. Hank gunned the ATV, taking the most direct route toward the east pasture. As he approached, he could see that the bear had singled out one of the cows with a calf at her side. The mother was positioning herself between her calf and the approaching threat, but she stood little chance against a determined grizzly. Cutting across the pasture, Hank maneuvered the ATV to place himself between the bear and the cattle. The yee-hee. Grizzly stopped, seeming surprised by this new development. It rose onto its hind legs again, sniffing the air and woofing its annoyance at the interruption. Hank revved the ATV's engine, hoping the noise would drive the bear off. The grizzly dropped to all fours again, but didn't retreat. Instead, it began circling to the right, still trying to reach the cow and calf. Hank followed its movement with the ATV, maintaining the barrier between predator and prey. For several tense minutes, this standoff continued, the bear circling, Hank countering each move. But the grizzly was persistent, and Hank could see it growing increasingly agitated, huffing and jawing, a sign of escalating aggression. This was no longer a curious bear simply testing boundaries. This was a predator, intent on its target. Deciding on a more direct approach, Hank reached for the flare gun in his pocket. Though it hadn't deterred the bear earlier that morning, in broad daylight and at this distance, it might be more effective. He fired, the red flare arcing through the air and landing just behind the grizzly with a bright flash and hiss. The bear flinched at the sudden noise and light, but didn't flee. Instead, it seemed to reach a decision. With a deep rumbling growl, it charged, not toward the cattle, but directly at Hank on the ATV. Time seemed to slow as the massive predator covered the ground between them with shocking speed. Hank dropped the spent flare gun and reached for his rifle, but he knew he wouldn't have time to aim and fire before the bear reached him. Instead, he gunned the ATV's engine and swerved hard to the left, narrowly avoiding the charging grizzly. The bear's momentum carried it past him, but it recovered quickly, wheeling around for another charge. This time, Hank had managed to unsling his rifle, but the bear was too close and moving too fast for him to take careful aim. He fired anyway, the shot going wide as the ATV bounced over the uneven ground. The missed shot seemed to further enrage the grizzly. It closed the distance again, and this time, one massive paw connected with the rear of the ATV as Hank tried to swerve away. The impact sent the vehicle into a skid, and Hank felt it beginning to tip over. He had just enough time to kick free of the machine before it rolled, the rifle flying from his grasp as he hit the ground hard. Winded but uninjured, Hank scrambled to his feet. The ATV lay on its side 10 feet away, and his rifle had landed in the tall grass, somewhere between him and the bear. The grizzly, momentarily confused by the rolling vehicle, was already turning its attention back to Hank. Without his weapons or vehicle, Hank's options were severely limited. The nearest fence line was 30 yards away, too far to reach before the bear could overtake him. His only hope was to make himself as intimidating as possible and hope the bear would back down. Drawing himself up to his full height, Hank raised his arms and shouted at the top of his lungs, "Hey, get out of here!" It was a desperate tactic, unlikely to work against a bear that had already shown unusual boldness, but it was all he had. The grizzly paused, perhaps momentarily startled by Hank's aggressive display. For one brief, hopeful moment, Hank thought it might actually work. Then the bear dropped its head and charged again, closing the distance between them with frightening speed. In that moment, Hank Murphy was certain he was about to die. The world, narrowed to the sight of 800 pounds of muscle and fur bearing down on him, paws the size of dinner plates churning up the earth, small eyes fixed on him with predatory intent. He braced himself for the impact, knowing there was nowhere to run, no way to fight back effectively. Then, from somewhere to his right, came the crack of a rifle shot. The bear flinched mid-charge but didn't stop. Another shot rang out, closer, this time, and the grizzly veered slightly, still coming, but its charge disrupted. A third shot, and the bear finally broke off its attack, turning away from Hank and lumbering toward the tree line, moving with purpose despite its injuries. Hank turned to see Miguel on horseback, rifle still raised and tracking the retreating bear. The ranch hand spurred his horse forward, drawing level with Hank. "Are you hurt, Mr. Murphy?" Miguel asked urgently, eyes still on the bear. "No," Hank managed, his heart pounding so hard he could barely speak. "Just shaken up. Good shooting, Miguel." "I only winged him," Miguel replied, lowering his rifle as the bear disappeared into the trees. "Didn't want to kill it unless I had to, like the game warden said. But it's wounded now." Hank nodded grimly. A wounded grizzly was even more dangerous than a healthy one, in pain, more aggressive, and likely to associate its injury with humans, making it even more likely to attack in the future. "We need to call Steve right away. A wounded bear needs to be tracked before it gets far." Together they gathered Hank's rifle and righted the ATV, which miraculously still ran despite its tumble. The cattle in the pasture had scattered to the far corner during the confrontation, but appeared uninjured. Hank knew they'd need to be moved as soon as possible. The scent of blood from the wounded bear would make them nervous for hours. Back at the ranch house, Hank called Steve immediately, reporting the attack and Miguel's defensive shots. The game warden's response was swift and serious. "I'm gathering the team now," he said. "A bear that's directly attacked a human, even if provoked by defending livestock, has crossed the line, and wounded it's doubly dangerous. We need to find it quickly." Within an hour, Steve arrived with the wildlife team and 2 additional game wardens from neighboring districts. They came equipped for a tracking operation: rifles, tracking dogs, first aid kits, and communication gear. Mike examined the scene of the attack with Hank and Miguel, taking detailed notes and photographs. 3 shots hit it, he confirmed with Miguel, who nodded. "One in the shoulder, I think. The others I'm not sure, happened too fast, but it was still moving well when it left." Mike nodded. Grizzlies can absorb an amazing amount of damage and keep going. Their hide and fat layer are incredibly thick, and their skull is nearly bulletproof. From the front, unless you hit vital organs or the spine, they often survive even multiple gunshot wounds. "So what's the plan?" Hank asked. "We track it," Steve said firmly. The dogs will follow the blood trail. Given its injuries, it probably hasn't gone far. These bears often find a sheltered spot to hole up when they're hurt. And when you find it? Hank pressed, though he already knew the answer. Steve met his gaze directly. A bear that charges a human unprovoked, especially after multiple problem behaviors like we've seen, meets the criteria for lethal removal. I've already cleared it with the regional supervisor. If we find it, and if it's the same bear-based, on the markings you've described, we'll have to put it down. Hank nodded. Despite the danger the bear posed, he felt no satisfaction at this outcome. The grizzly was a magnificent animal doing what came naturally to it. Hunting, establishing territory, seeking the most efficient food sources. It wasn't evil or malicious, just a predator following its instincts in a world increasingly constrained by human presence. But those same instincts now made it too dangerous to leave roaming near ranches and homes. As the tracking team prepared to set out, Hank insisted on joining them where the wounded animal had pushed through the undergrowth. It was heading steadily eastward, deeper into the Bighorn foothills, away from the ranch and toward the higher elevations where grizzlies typically preferred to den. As they moved further into the forest, the terrain became increasingly challenging. Steep slopes, dense underbrush, fallen logs creating natural obstacles. The pace slowed as the tracking dogs worked to maintain the scent, which was growing fainter as the bleeding apparently lessened. The afternoon was waning, shadows lengthening beneath the pines, creating a sense of urgency among the trackers. Finding a wounded grizzly in the dark was both extremely dangerous and nearly impossible. After nearly 2 hours of tracking, the dogs suddenly became more alert, pulling at their leads and whining softly. The lead handler raised his fist, signaling the group to stop. "He's close," the man whispered. "Dogs have a hot scent, maybe bedded down just ahead." Steve motioned for Hank and Miguel to stay back, while the wildlife team formed a careful perimeter, moving forward with extreme caution. Hank could feel his heart rate increasing again, the memory of the bear's charge still fresh in his mind. His rifle felt reassuring in his hands, but he hoped he wouldn't need to use it. Through gaps in the trees ahead, Hank caught glimpses of the wildlife officers moving into position. One of the dogs whined again, more urgently this time, and Hank saw its handler struggling to restrain it. Then, without warning, a deafening roar shattered the forest stillness. The grizzly erupted from a dense thicket 30 yards ahead, charging directly at the nearest wildlife officer. Everything happened at once. Shouting, the dogs barking frantically, the bear's roar continuing as it closed the distance with frightening speed. The officer managed to fire one shot before diving out of the bear's path, the bullet apparently missing or having little effect. The bear redirected, heading for another member of the tracking party. This time, multiple shots rang out as several officers fired simultaneously. The grizzly staggered but kept coming, its momentum carrying it forward even as more bullets struck it. It crashed into the second officer, sending him sprawling, before finally collapsing just yards away from where Hank and Miguel stood transfixed. For several tense seconds, no one moved, all eyes on the fallen bear, watching for any sign of continued movement. There was none. The massive creature lay still, its final roar replaced by the sudden heavy silence of the forest. Steve was the first to approach, rifle still at the ready. He circled cautiously, ensuring the bear was truly dead before signaling the all clear to the others. The officer who had been knocked down was quickly attended to by his colleagues, but appeared to have escaped with only bruises and a sprained wrist. Incredibly lucky, given the alternative. Hank approached the fallen grizzly with a mix of emotions: relief that the immediate danger was over, sadness at the necessary but unfortunate end of such a magnificent creature, and lingering adrenaline from the close call they'd all just experienced. The bear was even larger up close than it had appeared during their previous encounters. Its dark fur was matted with blood in several places where bullets had found their mark, including the earlier wounds from Miguel's rifle. "It's the same." "One," Mike confirmed after examining the bear's markings. "Male, fully mature, probably around 15 years old based on tooth wear, and huge. I'd estimate at least 800 pounds, maybe more." "Any idea why it was so aggressive?" Hank asked. 15. Hair's old for a grizzly, but not ancient." Mike shook his head as he examined the bear more carefully. "Can't know for certain until we do a full necropsy, but I'm not seeing any obvious injuries or conditions that would explain the unusual behavior, other than the recent gunshot wounds. Sometimes they just develop problematic behaviors, especially old males who've learned that humans and their livestock mean easy meals. It took the combined effort of 6 men to load the bear's carcass onto a sturdy tarp, which they would use to drag it back to a point where it could be loaded into one of the department's trucks. The sun was setting by the time they began the slow, laborious journey back, making their way carefully through the darkening forest. Night had fully fallen by the time they reached the edge of Hank's property, where vehicles could access the forest track. The bear's carcass was loaded into a truck for transport to the State Wildlife Lab, where it would be thoroughly examined and recorded. Its DNA, measurements, and stomach contents, all valuable data points in the ongoing management of Wyoming's grizzly population. As the wildlife officers prepared to depart, Steve pulled Hank aside. "There'll be paperwork," he said. "Reports to file, statements to take, but not tonight. We'll come back tomorrow, after we've all had some rest." Hank nodded, fatigue finally catching up with him as the adrenaline of the day's events faded. "I appreciate everything you and your team did, Steve. Could have gone a lot worse out there." "That's the job," Steve replied simply. "And Hank, for what it's worth, you did everything right. Nobody wants an outcome like this, but sometimes there's no better option." After the wildlife team had departed, Hank and Miguel rode back to the ranch house in weary silence. Martha was waiting on the porch, her face lined with worry that eased somewhat when she saw them both return uninjured. Gage bounded down the steps to greet them, the border collie's enthusiasm a welcome brightness after the tension of the day. "It's over," Hank said simply as he dismounted. "They got the bear." Martha studied his face, reading the complex emotions there. "Come inside," she said. "I've got dinner keeping warm, and I suspect you both could use something stronger than coffee." In the kitchen, Hank recounted the day's events while Martha set out a hearty meal of pot roast and potatoes. Miguel, who'd been invited to stay, listened quietly, adding details only when Hank's account didn't fully capture his perspective of the bear's charge and the tracking operation. After dinner, Martha brought out a bottle of whiskey, pouring generous measures for each of them. "To close calls," she said, raising her glass. "And to good shots," Hank added, nodding toward Miguel. "I owe you more than a drink, my friend." Miguel shook his head. "You would have done the same for me, Mr. Murphy. That's how it works out. Here." They talked late into the evening, the conversation gradually shifting from the day's dangers to lighter topics: ranch plans, local gossip, Miguel's daughter's upcoming graduation. It was a necessary decompression, a return to normalcy, after brushing so close to disaster. When Miguel finally departed for his home in town, Hank walked him to his truck. "Take tomorrow off," he said. "You've earned it." "Are you sure?" Miguel asked. "There's still that section of fence to finish and the cattle to move back." "It'll keep another day," Hank assured him. "Rest up. I've got some paperwork to deal with anyway when Steve comes back." Back inside, Hank found Martha in the living room, gazing out the window at the moonlit yard. He joined her, slipping an arm around her waist. "Penny, for your thoughts?" "Just thinking how quickly things can change," she said softly. "This morning everything was normal. Then suddenly you're facing down a grizzly, and by evening it's dead and we're all safe but shaken." She turned to face him. "When Miguel called from the east pasture to tell me what happened, I've never been so scared, Hank." He pulled her close, feeling the subtle tremor in her body that belied her outward calm. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," he said. "If I'd been smarter, I would have waited for backup before confronting that bear and let it kill one of our calves." Martha shook her head. "You did what you always do. Protect what's yours." "I wouldn't expect anything different." She stepped back, meeting his gaze directly. "But maybe next time the flare gun isn't enough. Promise me you'll take the rifle first." Hank nodded, understanding the fear behind her request. "I promise." They went to bed early, both exhausted by the day's events. Hank placed the flare gun on his bedside table out of habit, then hesitated, remembering how ineffective it had been against the grizzly's final charge. After a moment's thought, he moved it to the drawer and placed his rifle within easier reach instead. Some threats, he reflected, required more substantial responses than bright lights and noise. Sleep came quickly, but was interrupted by vivid dreams: the bear charging, Miguel's shots, the final confrontation in the forest, playing out with slight variations, but always the same intensity. Hank woke before dawn, as was his habit, feeling less rested than he'd hoped. Beside him, Martha slept on, her breathing deep and even. He slipped quietly from bed, not wanting to disturb her after yesterday's stress. In the kitchen, coffee brewing, Hank stood at the window watching the eastern sky lighten. The familiar routine was comforting after the previous day's chaos. Gage joined him, the border collie sensing his mood and pressing against his leg in silent companionship. As promised, Steve returned mid-morning with a stack of paperwork and a preliminary report on the bear. They sat at the kitchen table, Martha providing fresh coffee and then discreetly leaving them to their business. Necropsy's not complete yet, Steve explained, but the initial exam showed some interesting findings. The bear had an old injury to its right hind leg, a healed fracture that probably hampered its ability to hunt effectively. Might explain why it was going after easier prey like livestock. Hank nodded. That makes sense. Anything else? Its stomach contained beef, almost certainly from your steer based on the degree of digestion, but also garbage, plastic wrappers, food containers. Someone's been careless with their trash up in these hills, and this bear found it. Tourists. Probably, Hank suggested. We get a lot of weekend campers up by Mitchell Creek this time of year. Steve made a note. I'll send some rangers to check it out, maybe post some additional warnings about proper food storage. Too late for this bear, but might prevent the next one from developing bad habits. They spent the next hour completing the necessary forms, incident, reports, depredation documentation, statements about the bear's behavior and the circumstances of the shooting. It was tedious but important work, ensuring that both the wildlife management decisions and Hank's actions would be properly documented and justified if questions arose later. What happens now? Hank asked as they finished the last form. We'll continue monitoring the area for other bear activity, Steve replied. But I think the immediate danger has passed. The sow with cubs that Bill reported has moved north, according to our tracking data from her radio collar. No other large males have been reported in this immediate area. Steve gathered the completed paperwork and stood to leave. The department will want to interview Miguel as well, since he fired the first shots. Nothing to worry about, just procedure. And Hank, he added, his tone serious, while I hope you never have to face a situation like yesterday again, you should know that your actions were appropriate under the circumstances, protecting yourself and your livestock from an attacking bear is not just your right, it's common sense out here. After Steve departed, Hank spent the rest of the morning catching up on ranch work that didn't require venturing far from the house. By afternoon, curiosity had gotten the better of several neighbors who stopped by to hear the story firsthand. Jim Taylor arrived first, followed by Bill Erickson and Tom Harper. They gathered in Hank's kitchen, a spontaneous council of local ranchers seeking reassurance that the threat had been addressed. Heard you had yourself quite the adventure yesterday, Bill said, accepting a cup of coffee from Martha. Steve told me they got the bear, but not much else. Hank recounted the events again, his telling already becoming more measured with repetition, the raw fear of the moment slightly dulled by distance and perspective. His neighbors listened, intently, occasionally interrupting with questions or exclamations. So Miguel saved your bacon, Jim summarized when Hank described the bear's charge and the ranch hand's timely intervention. Good man to have around. Better shot than I gave him credit for, Hank agreed. 3 hits on a charging grizzly from horseback isn't luck. That's skill. Tom, the former Forest Service ranger, had been mostly quiet during Hank's account. Now he leaned forward, elbows on the table. You're lucky to be sitting here telling the story, he said bluntly. A bear that size, that aggressive, most folks don't walk away from that kind of encounter. Believe me, I know it, Hank replied soberly. Been going over it in my head all night. If Miguel hadn't shown up when he did, if that ATV had rolled differently, he shook his head. Lot of ways it could have gone worse. Well, I for one am glad it didn't, Martha interjected, refilling coffee cups around the table. And I'm glad that particular bear won't be causing any more problems for anyone in this valley. The conversation gradually shifted to lighter topics, local news, the weather, predictions for summer grazing conditions, but an undercurrent of awareness remained. Living alongside predators like grizzlies required constant vigilance, respect for their power, and occasional hard decisions. It was a reality that all of them accepted as part of life in this corner of Wyoming. As the neighbors departed one by one, each offering a variation of "glad you're okay" and "let me know if you need anything," Hank found himself reflecting on the strange mix of emotions the past 2 days had evoked. Fear certainly during the bear's charge, relief at his narrow escape and the elimination of the immediate threat, but also a certain sadness at the necessity of killing the grizzly. and a deeper appreciation for the precarious balance between humans and wildlife in this rugged landscape. That evening, as the sun set behind the bighorns, casting long shadows across his pastures, Hank sat on the porch with Martha. Gage lay at their feet. The border collie finally relaxed after 2 days of heightened alert. In the distance, their cattle grazed peacefully in the home pasture, unaware of how close they'd come to losing their caretaker. "Been thinking," Hank said after a comfortable silence, "might be time to look into getting some guard dogs. Livestock protection breeds that can warn off predators before they get too close to the herds." Martha nodded. "Not a bad idea, though no dog's going to stand up to a determined grizzly." "No, but they might make enough noise to discourage one from trying, or at least give us earlier warning." He took a sip of his coffee, which had cooled to lukewarm. "And maybe it's time to install that cell signal booster we've been talking about. If I'd been able to call Steve right away yesterday, things might not have escalated as they did." "Add it to the list," Martha agreed. "Right after fixing the ATV you rolled." Hank chuckled, though the humor was tinged with the sobering knowledge of how close he'd come to serious injury or worse. "Miguel's coming back tomorrow. Said he'd help me get it running again." "He's a good man," Martha said. "You should give him that raise he's been too polite to ask for." "Already planning on it," Hank assured her. "Figure I owe him at least that much." As darkness settled fully over the ranch, they moved inside, closing the door on the wilderness beyond. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges: fences to mend, cattle to move, equipment to repair. The rhythm of ranch life would reassert itself, the bear encounter gradually becoming another story to tell, another experience weathered and survived. Later, that night, as Martha slept beside him, Hank found himself still awake, replaying the moment of the bear's charge in his mind. The image of 800 pounds of muscle and fur bearing down on him remained vivid, likely would for years to come. But alongside the memory of fear was a growing sense of perspective. In 30 years of ranching in grizzly country, this had been his first truly dangerous encounter. The odds favored another 30 without incident, if he remained vigilant and respectful of the wilderness on his doorstep. Rolling onto his side, Hank glanced at the bedside table where the flare gun now resided in the drawer, replaced by his rifle in the more accessible position. A small change, symbolic of a shift in his thinking about preparedness and risk. The flare gun had served him well for years and would continue to have its uses, but some situations called for more definitive measures. It was a lesson hard-learned but not likely to be forgotten. As sleep finally began to claim him, Hank's last conscious thought was of the bear, not as the charging threat of his recent experience, but as it had been when he first spotted it in the clearing. Magnificent, powerful, perfectly adapted to its harsh environment, a worthy adversary deserving of respect even in conflict. In another time, another place, perhaps their paths would never have crossed in hostility. But in the complex intersection of wilderness and civilization that was modern Wyoming, such encounters were inevitable, with outcomes determined by chance, preparation, and the accumulated wisdom of those who chose to live alongside nature's most formidable predators. Miles away, in the dense forests of the higher bighorns, other bears continued their ancient patterns, foraging, hunting, raising cubs, oblivious to the drama that had played out below. Among them, perhaps, was the sow with yearlings that had started the chain of events leading to Hank's encounter. She would continue her life in the wilderness, hopefully maintaining a healthy fear of humans and their dwellings, teaching her cubs to do the same. The natural order would persist, the delicate balance maintained for another season through the careful dance of coexistence between predator and prey, wild and tame, nature and humanity. And in the ranch house at the edge of that wilderness, Hank Murphy finally slept, one hand resting on the rifle beside his bed, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring in the shadow of the Bighorn Mountains. Now let's move on to the story of the next survivor. The long shadow of a grizzly bear was the last thing Zoe Turner expected to see during her geological survey in Idaho's Sawtooth Wilderness. The mid-July sun cast golden rays through the dense pine forest as Zoe, clipboard in hand, methodically documented the mineral composition of rock formations protruding from the forest floor. At 34, Zoe had built a reputation as one of the most meticulous field geologists at the Idaho Geological Survey, her keen eye for detail and unwavering patience making her particularly suited for the painstaking work of cataloging the region's complex geological features. This summer project was meant to expand on previous surveys, filling gaps in their understanding of the area's mineral deposits and geological history. The Sawtooth Wilderness, with its jagged mountain peaks and pristine alpine lakes, was not only a paradise for outdoor enthusiasts, but also a treasure trove for geologists like Zoe, its exposed rock faces telling stories millions of years in the making. The morning had started routinely enough. Zoe and her small team, consisting of her colleague Marcus Delgado, a seasoned geologist with a specialization in igneous formations, and two graduate students, Amber Chen and Tyler Wilson, had set up base camp near the edge of the wilderness area 3 days earlier. Their modest camp consisted of 4 individual tents arranged in a loose semicircle, a larger communal tent for equipment and meals, and the standard bear-proof containers mandated by park regulations. The fieldwork itself was divided among the team members, with each person responsible for surveying specific quadrants before regrouping to compare findings. This particular morning, Zoe had set out alone to examine a promising outcropping of metamorphic rock about a mile from their camp, an area that had been flagged during previous aerial surveys but never properly documented on the ground. Zoe's backpack contained the standard field equipment: a rock hammer, hand lens, field notebook, sample bags, GPS device, topographic maps, compass, first aid kit, emergency satellite phone, and enough water and high-energy snacks to last the day. She also carried bear spray on her hip, a precaution that all field workers in bear country were required to take. During their safety briefing at the start of the expedition, the team had reviewed bear encounter protocols. They had discussed the importance of making noise while hiking to avoid surprising bears, traveling in groups when possible, properly storing food, and what to do in case of an encounter. The information wasn't new to Zoe. After nearly a decade of fieldwork in various wilderness areas, the safety protocols were second nature to her. Still, even experienced field researchers could find themselves in unexpected situations, especially in the vast expanses of wilderness where humans were merely visitors in the territory of creatures that had evolved to thrive there. The first few hours of her survey had been productive. The rock formation turned out to be even more interesting than anticipated, showing clear signs of pressure metamorphism that suggested significant tectonic activity in the region's distant past. Zoe's notebook was filling with detailed observations, sketches and questions for further investigation. She had just finished collecting several small rock samples, carefully placing them in labeled bags, when she first noticed the silence. The forest, which had been alive with the chatter of birds and the rustling of small animals, had grown eerily quiet. Years of fieldwork had taught Zoe to pay attention to these subtle changes in her environment. She paused, rock hammer in hand, and scanned her surroundings with a growing sense of unease. The first indication of the grizzly's presence wasn't visual, but olfactory, a musky animal smell carried on the gentle breeze. Then came a sound, the snap of a branch somewhere in the underbrush behind her. Zoe turned slowly, her heart beginning to pound against her ribcage as adrenaline flooded her system. And there it was, a massive grizzly bear, its shoulder height easily surpassing 3 feet, its weight likely approaching 600 pounds. The bear's dish-shaped face, distinctive hump on its shoulders, and the silver-tipped fur that gave grizzlies their silver-tip nickname were unmistakable. It stood approximately 30 yards away, its small eyes fixed on her with what seemed like curiosity rather than immediate aggression. Zoe's training kicked in automatically. She knew that running would trigger the bear's predatory instincts. Grizzlies can reach speeds of 35 miles per hour, far outpacing any human. Fighting was not an option against an animal of such size and strength. Instead, she froze, then slowly raised her arms to appear larger while speaking in a calm, firm voice. "Hey bear, I see you. I'm just passing through." The bear, which had been on all fours, rose to its hind legs, not necessarily a sign of aggression, but rather a way to better see and smell what it had encountered. Standing upright, the bear was an imposing figure, well over 7 feet tall. Zoe continued talking, her voice steady despite her racing pulse, as she slowly reached for the bear spray canister on her hip. The grizzly dropped back to all fours and took several steps forward, closing the distance between them with alarming speed. It was then that Zoe noticed the detail that changed everything: 2 small cubs trailing behind the adult bear, partially hidden by the underbrush. This wasn't just a grizzly, it was a mother grizzly with cubs, arguably the most dangerous bear for encounter scenario possible. Mother bears are notoriously protective of their young, perceiving any nearby human as a potential threat. The bear's body language shifted, its ears flattening against its head, its mouth opening slightly to reveal impressive canines. These were warning signs, precursors to a potential charge. With the mother bear now clearly agitated and the cubs complicating the situation, Zoe's options narrowed considerably. The bear spray was designed to be effective, but using it on a mother with cubs could escalate the situation unpredictably. If the spray didn't deter the mother completely, it might further enrage her. Additionally, if the wind direction changed, the spray could blow back into Zoe's face, incapacitating her at the worst possible moment. As the grizzly took another step forward, Zoe made a split-second decision based on her training. If a bear charges and contact appears inevitable, the best chance of survival is to play dead, particularly with a defensive mother grizzly. The bear charged, covering the remaining distance with startling speed, its massive paws throwing up dirt and leaf litter. Zoe had just enough time to turn slightly to the side, drop to the ground, curl into a fetal position with her hands clasped behind her neck, and play dead. The impact of the bear's initial contact knocked the wind from her lungs. The grizzly's enormous weight pressed down on her as it sniffed and prodded her body with its snout. Zoe could feel its hot breath on her neck, the coarse fur against her skin, the incredible strength in each movement of its massive body. Despite the overwhelming instinct to struggle or flee, Zoe remained motionless, her muscles locked in rigid control, her breathing shallow but steady. The examination seemed to last an eternity, though in reality it was likely less than a minute. The bear's powerful jaws could easily have crushed bone, its claws capable of disemboweling with a single swipe. Instead, apparently determining that Zoe posed no immediate threat to its cubs, the grizzly gave one final sniff and then moved away. Zoe remained perfectly still, knowing that bears will sometimes watch from a distance to see if their dead prey revives. Only when she could no longer hear the bear's movements did she risk the slightest turn of her head, opening one eye just enough to scan her surroundings. The grizzly and its cubs were moving away, the mother occasionally looking back, but continuing, on a path that took them deeper into the forest. Zoe waited 5 minutes after the bears disappeared from view, then slowly, painfully, began to move. Nothing seemed broken, but her body was already registering the effects of the encounter. Bruises forming where the bear's weight had pressed against her, scratches from its claws that had torn through her field jacket and drawn blood in several places. Her hands trembled as she reached for her satellite phone, her mind racing with the knowledge of how narrowly she had avoided a fatal encounter. Just as she was about to call her team, a new sound caught her attention, the distinctive huffing of a bear not retreating as she had thought but circling back. In a panic, Zoe scrambled to her feet and looked for escape. The nearest substantial tree was too far away and lacked low branches for climbing. The bear spray was still on her hip, but she hesitated to use it for the same reasons as before. A large rock formation about 15 feet high stood approximately 20 yards away, not ideal but potentially offering some protection if she could reach the top. With the sounds of the returning bear growing louder, Zoe made a dash for the rocks, her boots slipping on the pine needle-covered forest floor as she ran. She reached the rock face and began to climb, her fingers finding purchase in small crevices, her feet scrabbling for footholds on the rough surface. It was during this desperate climb that disaster struck. As Zoe reached for a seemingly stable handhold about halfway up the rock face, the stone crumbled under her grip. She lost her balance, her body twisting awkwardly as she tried to regain purchase. Her right arm extended fully as it bore her entire weight for a split second before. The shoulder joint gave way with an audible pop. The searing pain was immediate and overwhelming, causing her vision to momentarily blur. Despite the agony, primal fear drove her upward, her now useless right arm dangling at her side as she used her left arm and both legs to continue the climb. Somehow, she managed to reach the top of the rock formation, collapsing on the relatively flat surface as waves of pain radiated from her dislocated shoulder. From her elevated position, Zoe could see the grizzly and her cubs re-emerging from the tree line. The mother bear approached the base of the rocks, rising once again on her hind legs to sniff the air, but seemed unwilling to attempt the climb. After a few minutes of investigation, the bear dropped back to all fours, rounded up her cubs with gentle nudges, and finally moved away, disappearing into the dense forest. This time, Zoe did not move from her position, partly from caution, and partly because the pain in her shoulder had become almost unbearable, making any movement excruciating. With her left hand shaking violently, Zoe managed to extract the satellite phone from her pocket. The device was thankfully undamaged, and she was able to send an emergency signal to her team, along with basic text information about her location and situation. Now, all she could do was wait, conserving her energy and trying to manage the pain. The sun had passed its zenith and was starting its western descent, the shadows lengthening across the forest floor. Zoe knew that bears, particularly grizzlies, were most active at dawn and dusk. If help didn't arrive before evening, her situation could become even more precarious. As she waited, her mind alternated between hyper-focused awareness of her surroundings and hazy periods where the pain seemed to distance her from reality. She found herself analyzing the encounter with professional detachment. The bear's behavior had been entirely normal for a mother with cubs. There was no malice in its actions, no conscious desire to harm. It was simply responding to a perceived threat with the protective instincts honed by millions of years of evolution. Even her injury wasn't directly caused by the bear, but resulted from her panicked escape attempt. In the complex calculus of wilderness interactions, Zoe understood that she was the intruder in the bear's domain, not the other way around. It was nearly 2 hours later when she heard the first calls of her team members. "Zoe, can you hear me? Zoe?" Marcus's voice carried through the trees, followed by the voices of Amber and Tyler. Zoe used her good arm to wave and called back, her voice hoarse but audible. Within minutes, her team had found her, their expressions shifting from relief at finding her alive to concern as they took in her obvious injury and the blood on her torn clothing. "Grizzly," Zoe explained through gritted teeth as Marcus carefully helped her to a sitting position. "Mother with cubs. Played dead, she left, then started to come back. Dislocated my shoulder climbing up here." "Jesus, Zoe," Marcus breathed, his experienced eyes already assessing her injuries. "You're lucky to be alive." He turned to the graduate students. "Amber, get the first aid kit. Tyler, call the ranger station. Let them know we have a bear encounter and medical emergency." What followed was a careful extraction from the top of the rock formation. Marcus, who had wilderness first aid training, considered attempting to reset Zoe's dislocated shoulder in the field, but decided against it, given the length of time since the injury occurred and the possibility of complications. Instead, they fashioned a sling from a spare shirt, gave Zoe some mild painkillers from the first aid kit, and prepared for the trek back to their camp, where their vehicle was parked. The journey back was slow and painful, each step sending jolts of agony through Zoe's shoulder, despite the makeshift sling and the support of her colleagues. Halfway to camp, they were met by 2 park rangers who had responded to Tyler's call. The rangers, equipped with more substantial medical supplies, were able to better stabilize Zoe's arm and administer stronger pain medication before helping the group back to camp. Once there, one of the rangers radioed for a medical evacuation, explaining that the rough terrain made standard vehicle extraction inadvisable for a shoulder injury. As twilight descended on the wilderness, a medical helicopter arrived at a small clearing near their camp. The flight paramedic quickly assessed Zoe's condition, administered intravenous pain medication, and secured her for transport. As she was being loaded into the helicopter, Zoe caught a last glimpse of the rugged wilderness landscape, the twilight. Shadows now concealing any sign of the bear that had so dramatically altered her day. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had come to study the ancient history written in stones, only to be reminded of a more immediate and vital reality, the continuous dance between humans and wildlife in shared spaces, each with their own needs and instincts, sometimes colliding with consequential results. The helicopter ride to St. Luke's Wood River Medical Center in Ketchum was mercifully short, the powerful aircraft covering in minutes what would have been hours by ground transportation. In the emergency room, Zoe recounted her story multiple times, to the attending physician, to a wildlife official who had been notified of the bear encounter, and finally to a local sheriff's deputy who took an official report of the incident. X-rays confirmed what Zoe already knew, a dislocated shoulder with no fractures but significant soft tissue damage. The procedure to reduce the dislocation, to put the humeral head back into the glenoid socket, was performed under sedation, sparing her the worst pain of the maneuver. As the sedation wore off, Zoe found herself in a hospital room, her shoulder immobilized in a proper medical sling, an IV providing fluids and pain management. Marcus was sitting in a chair beside her, bed, his usual energetic demeanor subdued by concern and exhaustion. "Welcome back," he said when he noticed her eyes open. "Doctor says you were lucky. Clean dislocation, no tearing of the rotator cuff, no fractures. You'll need physical therapy, but they expect a full recovery." Zoe nodded, her mouth dry from the sedation. Marcus helped her with a small sip of water before continuing. "The wildlife officer wants to know more about the bear when you're up to it. They're taking it seriously. Mother with cubs in a survey area is a concern." He hesitated, then added, "But between you and me, I don't think they're going to do much. No fatalities, no serious mauling, and the bear was just doing what bears do." Zoe's suspicion that the official response would be limited proved accurate. The following morning, still in the hospital but more alert, she provided a detailed statement to 2 wildlife management officers. They recorded her description of the bear, its approximate size, the presence of cubs, the exact location of the encounter, and the bear's behavior before, during, and after the interaction. The officers were professional and thorough, but they were also realistic about what actions would follow. "We'll file the report and post warnings in the area," the senior officer explained. "We might set up trail cameras to monitor bear activity and potentially identify the specific animal, but unless there's another incident suggesting unusually aggressive behavior, we typically don't relocate bears for defensive reactions, especially mothers with cubs." Zoe understood and even agreed with this approach. The bear had behaved naturally, responding to a perceived threat to its young in its own territory. The encounter, while frightening and injurious to Zoe, didn't indicate an abnormally aggressive animal or one habituated to human presence and food, the kinds of bears that typically warranted intervention. Still, there was a part of her that felt the inadequacy of the response, a human desire for some form of acknowledgement or resolution that the natural world, operating on different principles, could not provide. She was discharged from the hospital the following day with prescriptions for pain management, detailed instructions for care of her shoulder, and referrals for follow-up appointments with an orthopedic specialist and physical therapist. Marcus drove her to a motel in Ketchum, where she would stay for a few days before being cleared for the longer journey back to Boise, where she lived. The graduate students had remained at the camp, continuing the survey work under Marcus's remote guidance, though they had relocated their camp away from the area of the bear sighting. In the quiet of the motel room, Zoe had time to process the events more fully. The physical pain was manageable with medication, but the psychological impact of the encounter was more complex. There was fear, certainly, a visceral memory of the bear's enormous presence, its breath, its power. There was also a curious sense of humility and perspective. The wilderness, which she had approached primarily as a subject of scientific study, had revealed itself as something more, a living system with its own imperatives, indifferent to human intentions or safety. The rocks she studied operated on a timescale of millions of years. The bear operated on the immediate imperatives of survival and protection of offspring. Both existed in their own realities, with humans moving between them, sometimes forgetting the different rules that governed each realm. News of her encounter spread quickly through local channels and the tight-knit geological community. By the time Zoe returned to Boise a week later, her voicemail and email were filled with messages from colleagues, friends, and even a few local reporters seeking interviews about her bear attack. Zoe declined the interview requests, uncomfortable. With the sensationalistic framing, many seemed to apply to the event. It hadn't been an attack in the predatory sense. The bear hadn't sought her out as prey or acted with unusual aggression. It was an encounter, an intersection of paths, with the bear responding according to its nature and Zoe according to hers. Her return to the offices of the Idaho Geological Survey was met with a mixture of concern, relief, and the dark humor that often characterizes professions where field dangers are an accepted part of the work. "Should we order you a suit of armor for your next field assignment?" joked her department head, Dr. Eleanor Simmons, during Zoe's first day back at the office. "Or maybe just restrict you to the desert, where the worst you'll face is a rattlesnake." The teasing was good-natured and even welcomed by Zoe, who preferred it to being treated as fragile or traumatized. Still, she found herself hesitating when Dr. Simmons brought up potential assignments for later in the season, once her shoulder had healed sufficiently for field work. "There's that promising site in the Owyhee Desert we've been wanting to survey, Doctor," Simmons suggested, perhaps noticing Zoe's unconscious tensing at the mention of returning to densely forested areas. Less dramatic landscapes than the Sawtooths, but interesting mineralogy. Might be a good project for getting back into the field. Zoe accepted the assignment with a sense of relief that surprised her. She had never considered herself particularly fearful of wildlife encounters. They were an expected part of wilderness work, but the visceral memory of the grizzly remained fresh. The Owyhee Desert, with its open sightlines and relative lack of large predators, suddenly seemed appealing in a way it never had before. The irony wasn't lost on her. Before the bear encounter, she had always preferred the forested mountain, regions with their rich biodiversity and dramatic landscapes. Now the stark, exposed geology of the desert called to her, promising a different kind of wilderness experience, one where threats could be seen from a distance, where the ancient stories written in stone weren't complicated by the immediate dramas of large predators and their offspring. The physical recovery proceeded as the doctors had predicted. Weeks of physical therapy gradually restored function to Zoe's shoulder, though certain movements still triggered twinges of pain, persistent reminders of that desperate climb up the rock face. The external scrapes and bruises from the bear's inspection healed quickly, leaving no visible scars, but Zoe knew that the medical records and the official incident report were the only tangible evidence of her encounter. There had been no photographs of the bear, no dramatic video footage, just her testimony and the resulting injury, neither of which fully captured the reality of those moments when she lay motionless under the investigating weight of one of North America's most powerful predators. In conversations with friends and family outside the geological community, Zoe found it difficult to convey the complex mixture of emotions the encounter had left her with. Many seemed to expect a simple narrative, either a harrowing tale of survival against a vicious predator or an ecological fable about harmonious coexistence with wildlife. The reality was messier, less satisfying as a story. Yes, she had been frightened. Yes, she had been injured. But she also recognized the bear's natural behavior, understood her own role in creating the situation by being in the bear's territory, and felt no anger or desire for retribution against the animal. This nuanced perspective sometimes disappointed listeners who wanted clearer villains and heroes, more dramatic action and resolution. Her parents, calling frequently from their retirement home in Arizona, vacillated between horrified concern and proud amazement that their daughter had survived such an encounter. "Maybe it's time to consider a job that keeps you in the lab more," her mother suggested during one call, her voice tight with retroactive fear. "All those fancy degrees, surely there's research you could do without hiking into bear country." "Mum, what happened was extremely rare," Zoe explained, having had variations of this conversation several times already. "Most field geologists work their entire careers without a significant wildlife encounter. And anyway, I'm already scheduled. For the Owyhee project, it's desert, not bear habitat. The desert has its own dangers," her mother countered, undeterred. "Rattlesnakes, scorpions, heat stroke, all of which are much easier to avoid than a surprise bear encounter," Zoe assured her. "Besides, I'm good at what I do, and field work is an essential part of it. I can't let one incident change my entire career path." Yet even as she said those words, Zoe recognized that the encounter had changed something in her approach to her work. She found herself being more cautious in planning, more attentive to wildlife reports in survey areas, more insistent on group work rather than solo excursions. These were positive adaptations, professional growth arising from experience, but they represented a shift nonetheless, an acknowledgement that the comfortable sense of control she had once felt in wilderness settings had been revealed as partly illusory. As summer transitioned to fall, Zoe's physical recovery progressed to the point where she was cleared for modified fieldwork. The Owyhee Desert project proceeded without incident, its wide horizons and sparse vegetation offering a stark contrast to the enclosed spaces of the Sawtooth wilderness. Zoe found herself appreciating the desert landscape in new ways, not just for its geological features, which had always interested her professionally, but for its openness, its legibility, the way it displayed its inhabitants and hazards without concealment. At night, in her tent at the desert base camp, she slept more soundly than she had in the mountains, the absence of rustling forests and large predators allowing a deeper relaxation than she had expected to feel so soon after her encounter. The bear incident report, meanwhile, had made its way through official channels and been filed away with minimal follow-up. The wildlife management officers had posted temporary warning signs in the area of the sighting and added the information to their database of bear activity in the region, but no bear matching Zoe's description was identified through their limited camera trapping efforts. As predicted, without evidence of predatory or unusually aggressive behavior, no effort was made to locate or relocate the bear and her cubs. By late fall, when the bears would be entering their pre-hibernation period of intensified feeding, the warning signs were removed. The incident effectively closed from an administrative perspective. For Zoe, however, closure was more elusive. The encounter existed now in two forms: as an official report with bureaucratic language and categorical classifications, filed away in government databases, and as a lived experience that continued to surface in unexpected moments. Sometimes, walking alone at dusk in Boise's urban parks, she would catch a particular scent, a mix of damp earth and animal musk, that would instantly transport her back to that moment when she first detected the grizzly's presence. Other times, the particular quality of silence that precedes significant wilderness encounters would manifest even in mundane settings. A conversation suddenly pausing at a dinner party, the brief hush before a concert began, triggering a rush of hyper-awareness that was both exhausting and oddly exhilarating. Zoe's colleagues at the survey noticed these moments of distraction or heightened alertness, but generally attributed them to the ongoing physical discomfort of her healing shoulder rather than psychological after-effects of the encounter itself. Zoe didn't correct this assumption. The physical injury provided a convenient and easily understood explanation for behaviors that might otherwise prompt uncomfortable questions or, worse, expressions of pity. She didn't see herself as traumatized, changed, certainly more aware of certain realities, but not damaged in any way that required professional intervention or special accommodation. This self-assessment was tested in early winter when Dr. Simmons called Zoe into her office to discuss the following year's field assignments. The team that took over the sawtooth survey after your incident wasn't able to complete all the priority areas, Dr. Simmons explained, sliding a folder across her desk. We're planning to send another group back in early summer to finish the work. Given your familiarity with the project, you'd be a natural choice to lead the team. She paused, studying Zoe's face carefully. Unless, of course, you'd prefer a different assignment. The question hung in the air between them. Zoe was aware that her response would signify something beyond a simple professional preference. It would be an indication of how deeply the bear encounter had affected her willingness to return to similar environments. She thought carefully before answering, aware of both the practical considerations and the symbolic weight of her decision. I appreciate the consideration, she finally said, but I think I'd prefer to focus on completing the Owyhee project and perhaps expanding it to the adjacent regions we've been discussing. There's still a lot of unexplored potential there, and continuity would be valuable. She kept her tone matter-of-fact, professional rather than emotional. For the sawtooth work, Marcus has just as much familiarity with the original research parameters, and he works well with the graduate students who've already been on site. Dr. Simmons nodded, neither approving nor disapproving of Zoe's choice. That's a reasonable allocation of resources, she agreed, making a note in her calendar. I'll discuss the sawtooth assignment with Marcus. She closed the folder and looked up at Zoe with a more personal expression. You know, no one would think less of you if you decided not to return to that specific area. Field scientists understand the realities of wildlife encounters. Sometimes discretion is the better part of valor. It's not fear, Zoe said, perhaps too quickly. It's just practical. My research interests have been shifting toward arid environments anyway, and the Owyhee project aligns better with that direction. Even as she spoke, Zoe recognized the partial truth in her words. Her interest in desert geology was genuine, but it had become more pronounced after the bear encounter, in a way that couldn't be entirely separated from that experience. Of course, Dr. Simmons replied, her tone neutral. Professional evolution is natural. We all find our niches eventually. She didn't press the issue further, allowing Zoe the dignity of her rationalization. This was the way of their profession, Zoe realized, acknowledgement of risks and their potential impacts, but without dwelling on fears or limitations. The wilderness demanded respect, without becoming an object of paralyzing fear. Individual responses to close calls were honored without excessive scrutiny. As winter settled over Idaho, bringing snow to the mountains and early darkness to the shortened days, Zoe found herself thinking more about the bear and her cubs. By now, they would be in hibernation, their massive bodies subsisting on the fat reserves built up during the productive summer and fall months, their metabolism slowed to a fraction of its normal rate. There was something appealing about this. Biological strategy, the long period of dormancy, the withdrawal from the world's demands, the conservation of energy during times of scarcity. Humans had no physiological equivalent, required to remain active and vigilant through all seasons, adapting through technology and behavioral modifications rather than biochemical transformation. During a holiday gathering at a colleague's home, the bear story inevitably emerged as a topic of conversation. Most of her co-workers knew the basic facts, but in social settings with partners and friends from outside the survey present, there was often pressure for Zoe to recount the experience in more vivid detail. She had developed a standardized version of the story for such occasions, factual but streamlined, emphasizing her training and the predictable nature of bear behavior rather than the moments of terror or the ongoing physical discomfort from her injury. "So you actually played dead? And it worked?" asked the partner of one of the survey's administrative staff, her eyes wide with fascinated horror. "I don't think I could do that. Just lie still while a massive bear is right there." "It's counterintuitive," Zoe acknowledged, "but it's the recommended response for defensive attacks, especially from grizzlies. They're primarily interested in neutralizing perceived threats, not in predation. Once they determine you're not a threat, they generally move on." She delivered this explanation in the same tone she might use to describe a geological process: factual, educational, emotionally neutral. "But weren't you terrified?" the woman pressed, apparently unsatisfied with Zoe's clinical description. "I mean, having a wild animal that could kill you with one swipe just sniffing around you?" Zoe hesitated, uncomfortable with the push toward sensationalism, but recognizing the natural human curiosity behind the question. "Yes, there was fear," she admitted. "But in those situations, training tends to override immediate emotional responses. The fear was there, but it wasn't the dominant experience." This was a simplification, but trying to articulate the complex blend of terror, hyper-awareness, resignation, and scientific observation that had characterized those moments seemed impossible in the context of casual conversation. "And now you stick to the desert," commented another colleague with a knowing smile. "Can't say I blame you. I'd probably never go back into the woods after something like that." "The Oahe project is fascinating in its own right," Zoe said, the familiar justification coming easily now. "The desert preserves geological evidence in different ways than forested regions. There are scientific reasons for the shift in focus." She took a sip of her wine, signaling a desire to change the subject. "Speaking of which, the preliminary findings from the autumn survey are showing some unexpected mineral distributions. We might be looking at evidence of a previously unrecognized volcanic episode in the region's formation." The conversation obediently shifted to safer professional ground, but Zoe remained aware of the subtext that had been established: the bear encounter as a watershed moment, a dividing line between her earlier professional self and her current caution, her new preference for environments where large predators were less of a concern. The narrative wasn't entirely accurate, but it had the strength of apparent logic and dramatic structure. It was simpler than the truth, that the encounter had changed her in ways both subtle and profound, not reducible to simple fear or avoidance, but altering her perception of wilderness, her sense of her place within it, and her understanding of the thin membranes separating routine scientific work from life-altering moments of natural intersection. As the new year began, bringing with it the planning cycle for spring and summer fieldwork, Zoe found herself increasingly comfortable with her decision to focus on desert environments. The Oahe project had expanded in scope, with promising findings leading to additional research questions and survey needs. Marcus had readily accepted leadership of the follow-up Sawtooth Wilderness Survey, assembling a team that included both experienced field researchers and new graduate students eager for mountain fieldwork. The division of labor seemed natural, a logical allocation of human resources based on experience and research interests rather than a concession to traumatic experience. In late January, an unexpected email arrived in Zoe's inbox, a notification from the Idaho Department of Fish and Game that the incident report she had filed following the bear encounter had been included in a research study on human-wildlife interactions in the state's wilderness areas. The study, conducted by wildlife biologists at Boise State University, was analyzing patterns in reported encounters to better understand the factors that contributed to negative outcomes versus those that ended without serious injury. The researchers requested her permission to use the details of her experience anonymized as part of their dataset. Zoe granted permission readily, even offering to speak with the researchers directly if they had questions beyond what was contained in the official report. A week later, she found herself sitting in a small conference room at the university, opposite two wildlife biologists, Dr. James Chen, a specialist in large predator behavior, and his graduate student Layla Nazari, whose dissertation focused on human dimensions of wildlife management in the Mountain West. "We appreciate you taking the time to speak with us, Dr." Chen began after introductions had been made. "The official reports are valuable, but they often lack the nuance of direct conversation. We're particularly interested in the decision-making process during wildlife encounters. What information individuals had beforehand, how they applied it in the moment, and how the experience has affected their subsequent behavior in wildlife habitats." For the next hour, Zoe answered their questions, finding herself able to discuss the encounter with greater detail and emotional honesty than she typically did in social settings. These researchers understood the complex interplay of factors involved, asked questions that acknowledged both the biological realities of bear behavior and the psychological realities of human responses to perceived danger. There was no expectation of either heroic narrative or cautionary tale, simply professional interest in a data point that could contribute to better understanding and management of human-wildlife interactions. "Your case is particularly interesting because you did everything right according to current best practices," Layla commented as the interview was winding down. "You carried bear spray, you made noise while hiking, you reacted appropriately when you saw the bear, and you played dead when charged by a defensive mother with cubs, and it worked. The outcome, while not ideal, avoided the worst-case scenario. Yet you mentioned that you've since shifted your fieldwork to desert environments. Can you talk a bit about that decision?" The question was asked without judgment, simply seeking to understand the human dimension of post-encounter behavior. Zoe considered her response carefully, wanting to be honest with these researchers whose work might help others navigate similar situations. "It's not a simple case of fear or avoidance," she explained, organizing her thoughts as she spoke. "I still go hiking in bear country for recreation, still feel comfortable in those environments in general. The shift in my professional focus is more subtle." She paused, searching for the right words. "I think what changed was my understanding of the balance between risk and necessity. Before the encounter, I approached all wilderness fieldwork with the same basic risk assessment, awareness of potential hazards, but confidence in protocols and training to manage those risks. The encounter showed me that while protocols are valuable, they don't eliminate the fundamental unpredictability of wilderness interactions." Dr. Chen nodded encouragingly, and Zoe continued, "In my professional context, I have the luxury of choice in many field assignments. The geological features I study exist in multiple environment types. Given that reality, it makes sense to factor in personal risk tolerance when selecting projects. It's not that I won't work in bear country, again if a project genuinely requires it, but I'm more conscious now of whether that additional risk element is necessary for the specific research goals." "That's a nuanced perspective," Layla acknowledged, making notes. "Much of our research focuses on helping people develop appropriate risk assessments for wildlife areas, neither excessive fear that prevents valuable wilderness experiences nor casual disregard for legitimate dangers. Your experience and subsequent processing of it provides a useful case study in evidence-based risk management." "I'm glad something positive might come from it," Zoe said with a small smile. "Though I'll admit, I sometimes question whether I'm being rational in my changed preferences, or if I'm allowing one relatively rare event to unduly influence professional decisions." "That's a common concern after wildlife encounters," Dr. Chen assured her. But from what you've described, your response seems measured rather than phobic. You're not avoiding all potential bear habitat or experiencing intrusive fear responses that impair normal functioning. You're making context-specific risk assessments that acknowledge both objective hazards and subjective comfort levels, which is actually the approach we try to encourage. The conversation with the wildlife researchers provided Zoe with a framework for understanding her own responses that was more scientifically grounded than the simplistic narratives that had emerged in social and professional settings. She wasn't afraid of bears in some generalized way, nor was she making irrational decisions based on a single traumatic experience. Rather, she was incorporating new data points into her personal risk assessment model, adjusting her behavior based on updated information about both external realities and internal responses. This reframing helped Zoe reconcile her continued love of wilderness with her shifted professional focus, allowing her to see continuity rather than rupture in her relationship with wild places. As winter gave way to early spring, preparations for the summer field season intensified. Zoe's expanded Owyhee Desert project had been fully approved, with a generous budget allocation reflecting the promising preliminary findings from the previous survey. She assembled her team with care, selecting colleagues and graduate students who showed particular interest in arid environment geology and demonstrated the physical stamina needed for desert fieldwork. The planning process was meticulous, with detailed consideration given to water supplies, heat management protocols, and emergency response plans for the specific challenges of desert research. During this busy period, Zoe received an unexpected phone call from Marcus, who was similarly engaged in preparations for the Sawtooth Wilderness follow-up survey. "I've got a weird situation," he began without preamble. "One of the graduate students assigned to my team, Tyler Wilson, you remember him from last summer, just requested to join your Owyhee project instead. Says he's developed a particular interest in desert geology." Marcus's tone made it clear he wasn't convinced by this sudden shift in academic focus. "Since he was on site during your bear incident, I'm wondering if there's more to it. Have you heard anything from him?" "Nothing directly," Zoe replied, surprised. Tyler had seemed enthusiastic about the mountain survey work the previous summer, showing particular aptitude for the physical demands of wilderness hiking and climbing. Maybe the bear encounter affected him more than he let on at the time. "That's what I'm thinking," Marcus agreed. "He was pretty shaken up when we found you, though he held it together while we were getting you off that rock and back to camp. Look, I'm not trying to poach your project slots, but if this is about the bear rather than a genuine research interest, maybe it's better to address it directly. Kid's going to encounter uncomfortable situations throughout his career, can't just avoid them and still do effective field geology." Zoe felt a twinge of defensiveness at this implicit criticism, which seemed to echo the unspoken judgments she sometimes perceived from colleagues regarding her own shifted focus. "Sometimes valid scientific interests and personal comfort align," she pointed out, keeping her tone collegial. "The Owyhee project has legitimate research value. If Tyler wants to explore that area of geology, it might be for multiple reasons, not just bear avoidance." "Fair enough," Marcus conceded. "I'm not trying to psychoanalyze the guy, just thought you should know the context if he approaches you about joining your team. Whatever you decide is fine by me, I've got plenty of eager applicants for the mountain work." After the call, Zoe sat at her desk, contemplating the implications of Tyler's request. Was he, like her, recalibrating his risk assessments following their shared experience? Was this a normal, even adaptive, response to a frightening encounter? Or was it, as Marcus seemed to suggest, an avoidance behavior that might limit his professional development? And who was she to judge, given her own choices in the aftermath of the same incident? The questions remained unresolved when Tyler himself appeared at her office door later that week, looking somewhat nervous but determined. "Dr. Turner, do you have a moment? I wanted to discuss the possibility of joining your Owyhee project this summer." Zoe invited him in, observing him with fresh attention. Tyler was in his second year of graduate studies, a solidly built young man with an outdoorsman's, weathered complexion and confident bearing. Nothing in his appearance suggested someone unduly affected by past experiences, but Zoe knew better than most how such impacts could be concealed beneath professional composure. "Marcus mentioned you might be interested," she said, gesturing for him to take a seat. "I admit I'm a bit surprised, given your focus on alpine geology in your coursework. Tyler nodded, meeting her gaze directly. I know it seems like a sudden shift, and to be completely honest with you, the bear encounter last summer is part of it, not in the way you might think, he added quickly, perhaps sensing her thoughts. It's not that I'm afraid to go back to that area. It's more that the experience made me think about the kinds of environments where I do my best work, where I feel most present. The phrasing caught Zoe's attention. Present? Yeah, mentally focused, I guess, Tyler elaborated. After what happened with you and the bear, I noticed that in the densely forested areas, I was spending a lot of mental energy on environmental awareness, listening for animals, checking for signs of bears, scanning the surroundings, energy that wasn't going into the actual geological observations. In more open terrain, I found I could focus more completely on the rocks, the formations, the evidence I was there to collect. He shrugged slightly. The desert project seems like a good opportunity to work in an environment where my attention isn't constantly divided. Zoe nodded slowly, recognizing in Tyler's articulation a more precise expression of her own experience than she had previously formulated. It wasn't simply about avoiding bears, it was about the quality of attention possible in different environments, the cognitive resources available for primary research tasks versus those allocated to situational awareness and threat assessment. That makes sense, she said. And yes, there's room on the OIHI team if you're genuinely interested in the research questions we're pursuing. Have you reviewed the preliminary findings from last season? The conversation shifted to scientific specifics, Tyler demonstrating sufficient familiarity with the project's goals and methodologies to confirm that his interest wasn't merely a pretext for avoiding bear country. By the time he left her office, Zoe had provisionally added him to the team roster, pending approval from his academic advisor. The interaction left her with a sense of validation, not just of her decision to include Tyler in the project, but of her own evolving understanding of how the bear encounter had shaped her professional choices through mechanisms more complex than simple fear or avoidance. As spring progressed, bringing the summer field season closer, Zoe found herself occasionally thinking about the grizzly and her cubs. By now, they would have emerged from hibernation, thin after their long winter fast, hungry and actively searching for food in the awakening forest. The cubs, no longer quite so small, would still be with their mother, learning the complex behaviors necessary for survival in their mountain environment, how to find food, recognize threats, navigate territories. It would be another year, perhaps two, before they separated from their mother to establish their own ranges. Zoe wondered if the mother bear remembered their encounter, if somewhere in that complex ursine brain there was a stored memory of the human who had played dead beneath her investigative weight, who had presented no threat to her cubs, and had been allowed to survive as a result. Such anthropomorphic speculation was scientifically dubious, Zoe knew. Bears certainly had memory, could learn from experience, and exhibited complex problem-solving abilities, but their cognitive processes were fundamentally different from human consciousness. The bear hadn't decided to spare Zoe in any human sense of moral choice. It had responded to stimuli according to instinctual patterns shaped by evolution to maximize survival in its ecological niche. Yet the question of memory, of shared experience across the species barrier, continued to fascinate her, a reminder of the ultimately unknowable internal states of the creatures with whom humans shared wild spaces. These reflections were interrupted by the practical demands of final preparations for the field season. Equipment needed to be checked and packed, permits secured, team members briefed, travel arrangements confirmed. The OIHI Desert Project would begin in early June, taking advantage of the relatively moderate temperatures of late spring before the full intensity of summer heat made extended fieldwork challenging. Zoe found herself looking forward to the work with genuine enthusiasm, anticipating the stark beauty of the desert landscape, the exposed geological features telling their ancient stories without the concealing overlay of dense vegetation, the wide horizons offering visibility that created a different relationship with the environment than the enclosed spaces of mountain forests. The night before departure for the field site, Zoe found herself unable to sleep, her mind cycling through mental checklists and contingency plans. Rising from bed, she moved to the window of her Boise apartment, looking out at the city lights against the dark backdrop of the foothills. Somewhere beyond those initial rises, The land stretched into the Owyhee Desert to the southwest and into the Sawtooth Mountains to the northeast, different landscapes shaped by different geological processes, each with their own challenges and revelations, their own forms of beauty and danger. In that quiet moment of reflection, Zoe recognized that the bear encounter had given her something valuable alongside its costs, a more visceral understanding of her place within the natural world, not as an observer separate from the systems she studied, but as a participant in ongoing ecological dramas. The dislocated shoulder, now healed but occasionally aching with changes in weather, served as a physical reminder of this interconnection, a kind of somatic knowledge that complemented her intellectual understanding of natural systems. The encounter had changed her, certainly, but perhaps change was a neutral term, neither positive nor negative in itself, simply a recognition that experiences leave their marks, alter perspectives, shift priorities in ways that become incorporated into the continuing story of a life. With this thought came a sense of resolution, not the false closure of simplified narratives, but the more complex integration that acknowledges both continuity and transformation. Zoe Turner before the bear encounter and Zoe Turner after were the same person, the same geologist with the same professional passions and capabilities, but with an expanded understanding of the wilderness contexts in which she worked. A more nuanced assessment of risks and responses, a deeper appreciation for the unpredictable intersections between human activities and wildlife behaviors in shared landscapes. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Zoe finally returned to bed, falling into a brief but deep sleep before her alarm signaled the beginning of the new field season. She awoke feeling surprisingly refreshed, ready for the work ahead, carrying with her the memory of the grizzly like a stone collected from a significant location, not a burden, but an artifact, a tangible reminder of a moment when different worlds briefly overlapped, leaving both unchanged in their essentials, but marked in ways that only the direct participants could fully comprehend. The bear had continued on its path through the forest that day, disappearing into the wilderness that was its home, while Zoe had followed her own path back to the human world of medical intervention, official reports, and professional adaptations. The encounter existed now primarily in memory, in Zoe's conscious recollections, and perhaps, in some form she could never access or understand, in the bear's experiential history as well, a brief intersection of lives operating according to different imperatives but sharing, for that moment, the same physical space in the ancient mountains that would long outlast them both.